Greetings, everyone. This is Thersites the Historian. I'm joined here by Sean Chick, and today we're discussing British generals of the American War for Independence. In a poll I conducted on YouTube, I asked you what you thought we'd be doing next. Quite a few of you in the comments did say that you suspect this is what will happen, but voting-wise, I believe Russian generals in World War I was victorious. At any rate, I have no idea why anybody fell for that one. I should have really put Napoleon's opponents on there as one of the baits, because I think that one would have gotten about 50%, but I didn't, so whatever. So, what we've done here is we've assembled 22 British commanders from the American War for Independence. Of course, this is far from all of the officers involved in that conflict, but we'll have two lists, one of Americans, one of British, both 22 long. Today we're doing the British. And you may have noticed that these pictures are not paintings from the era. These are actually taken from the Coe strategy game Liberty or Death. Coe has been making strategy games for probably 30 or 40 years at this point, and the 90s was a time when Coe was experimenting quite a bit with different subjects and themes. They produced the game L'Empereur for the NES, which was about the career of Napoleon, and in, I believe it was 1993, they released Liberty or Death for the PC, Sega Genesis, and Super Nintendo. And this is where you can play as either side during the American War for Independence. And they did a surprisingly detailed breakdown of pretty much all the major officers involved in the war, down to some fairly minor people, including captains. So fortunately, they had all of the major players as well. And by the way, if you've never played a Coe game, I very much recommend it. They have a couple of new games I haven't had the chance to try. Romance of the Three Kingdoms 13 and 14 look pretty cool, but I don't really have time right now to indulge in that. So Sean, can you explain why you chose these 22 people as opposed to some of the alternatives?
Yeah, for this one, I mostly want to choose British officers who were involved, either had an independent command at some point or were particularly important to the war, but mostly that they would have an independent command of some variety, which is why there are almost no Hessians on this list. British really went out of their way to make sure that German commanders did not have any. And now there are some exceptions like Bennington and Trenton. I could have included those guys, but I went ahead and went with the gentlemen who were on this list. Because in those cases, both of those were more like detachments, and just about everybody here was given major independent of some form. So that's kind of what determined my list, you know. So we got one Hessian and a lot of Brits.
Yep, I already know who the Hessian is just based on his name, which is
yeah.
Isn't that shocking? A bit, yeah. From the pack. All right. Well, let's talk about general criteria for excellence in the American War for Independence. What would a British officer have needed in terms of qualities and preparation to really succeed at warfare in this conflict?
It's a very hard war for the British. And as you're going to see on this list, there's not a ton of outright incompetence, but there's not a lot of stellar officers either. Just about everybody on this list had, I mean, not everybody, there's a few dunders, there always is, but almost all these guys on this list had at least one important victory under their belt. But that said, a variety of them were not up to the task, and that's because it's an extremely difficult task. So let's think about this. You are in the British Army. You are being sent across the Atlantic Ocean to America. There are pockets of loyalists, but the loyalists, the best estimates we have today are loyalists probably counted for 20% of the population. And at first in the war, the British didn't even really use the loyalists much. Now, one of the reasons for this is they didn't, with the Howe brothers, William and Richard, William being the general, Richard being the admiral, were trying to fight a relatively soft war. Their idea was, you know, you beat Washington's army, you occupy some key cities, and they'll just eventually give. That didn't work out, of course. I would say that for excellence for the British, what you would need, of course, is a decent grasp of tactics, very good leadership skills. These are not big battles to fight in the American Revolution. These are very small battles. Probably only Long Island is one of the only battles of the war that would have been recognized as a major European battle. And even then, it probably wouldn't be because it only involves at most around that would count as a major European battle in terms of the number of men engaged. The losses were relatively light considering how many men were engaged. So that doesn't mean they didn't have bloody battles in this war. I mean, Bunker Hill, for the number of men engaged, is horrific. There's one estimate that says that something like 20% of all the British officers who were killed or wounded in the American Revolution in a battle were killed or wounded at Bunker.
Damn.
Yeah. So you do have individual battles that are very savage with very high casualty rates, but they're still very small in scope compared to what's going on in Europe. So it's very important to have that personal leadership touch in particular. If you're a commander of a British army, it's not a particularly big British army. One would need to be able to have a good mix of both light infantry and line infantry tactics. That's because, on the one hand, many of the battles could have looked like anything out of Europe. And then you have other battles where, of course, you're fighting the woods. And by fighting the woods, I don't mean that moronic idea we have, the British hid behind... I mean, we hid behind trees, and the British are morons, and they marched in and got slaughtered. Of all the historical myths around, it's one of the ones that pisses me off the most, because it's utterly moronic. It assumes the British are too stupid to hide behind a tree.
But Sean, have you not seen The Patriot? Come on, man.
I want to know for the record right now that The Patriot is my most hated movie of all time.
Duly noted. All right, well, I'll have to make sure to make as many Patriot references as possible over the next 2 videos then.
It is a movie that I literally hate on every conceivable level. Braveheart is bad history, but I will admit, it's a well shot movie. It's got good music. The actors get into the roles. It's got some memorable lines. The Patriot is poorly shot. The music is crap. The actors have no good lines. The history is about as bad as Braveheart, if not worse. I mean, at least in Braveheart, they showed battles that happened. The last battle shown in The Patriot never happened. Like, it never occurred. It's treated as this major historical event in the movie, and you're like, that battle literally never happened.
Well, I mean, didn't you know that The Patriot is alternative history, though?
It is.
Mel Gibson was taking liberties with the material and, just crafting his own version, kind of like Apocalypto.
There's something about... Yeah, I kind of like Apocalypto because it's Apocalypto has an advantage over The Patriot. Well, for one thing, Mel Gibson didn't direct The Patriot. And for another thing, Mel Gibson's crazy, and that comes through in Apocalypto. And I do like things that are, crazy. All right? Like, watching Apocalypto, you can tell it was made by a nut job. I love it. Not the movie, but I love that it's made by a nut job,
Yeah, and the thing that killed Mel Gibson's career, for anybody who doesn't remember, is that he was once pulled over by the police, and he tried to bribe a cop, and also was rambling about the Jews or something, and he was, completely wasted, so he was way beyond the legal limit, and he got a massive DUI. And then when it came out what he said, yeah, that kind of soured the water for him a bit.
Yeah, although he's still been able to make some movies. He made the movie Hacksaw Ridge.
Oh, really?
About Battle of Okinawa. Yeah, very good movie. Actually, I'd probably say it's Mel Gibson's best movie.
Yeah.
I never saw Passion of the Christ because I had no interest.
Yeah, that kind of... I wasn't a big fan. I feel like they focused a lot more on details than on making it historically valuable in any way. And also, the whole thing is more based on medieval plays about the Passion than on any kind of ancient history.
I mean, that actually in some ways makes it to me more interesting in a way. But I wouldn't be treating it as a historical movie necessarily. I mean, I don't know. I haven't seen a ton of Jesus movies, but the ones I have seen, like they would show in Catholic school, they weren't very good.
Yeah, most of them aren't. I mean, they have a new genre now of films made for and by evangelicals, the God's Not
Yeah.
Dead series and some of those, and those are some of the worst movies ever made.
Oh yeah, they're terrible, man.
Just total
I
shit.
I will say I'm a big fan of Martin Scorsese's Last Temptation of Christ. And actually, the movie came out a few years ago called Silence, which is also about religious issues. And that one involves missionaries going to
Although, one thing I will say for Passion of the Christ, I do respect the level of detail and dedication they went to make sure that all of the characters are speaking Aramaic.
Yeah, I heard people were very impressed by that, yeah.
That part was pretty impressive because that is not one that is commonly taught. So all the actors had to learn this language they'll never be able to use again for any other role in their entire lives. And they stuck with it. And, I guess maybe it might have been more effective had they chosen a different language that didn't need subtitles. But ultimately this was for evangelical Christians in the age of George Bush. So
it was noted, though. It made a lot of money.
It did. It's because it felt authentic because of the Aramaic and they beat the fucking shit out of the guy who played Jesus.
Yeah, Jim. I think it was Jim Caviezel. I will say this: I do kind of respect that. They tried to make the movie. Hollywood wouldn't make it. Make of that what you will. I do happen to agree with conservatives when they complain about Hollywood liberal bias. I do agree with them on that one for sure. So I kind of like the fact that it made money only because I root for independent filmmakers of any variety.
Yeah.
So make your own movie and it's a big hit and you're essentially like telling these guys to shove it up their ass. I'm like, cool. I kind of like that.
Yeah, I mean, that aspect of it is pretty cool. I'm surprised there wasn't at least one Hollywood studio who was willing to say, fuck the cocktail crowd, I'm going to make some cash.
Yeah, by that time, though, it was being made in the Bush era. I think it was. I think there's also a case being made that by about that time, you've always had a political slants in Hollywood with anything, But I feel like the kind that we live with right now was really starting to rear its head, which was very well made fun of in Team America: World Police.
Yeah, with the Screen Actors Guild or the Film Actors Guild in that movie, but yeah.
I still contend that is the finest Matt Damon role ever.
Possibly.
That is my favorite Matt Damon acting. I really don't like Matt Damon, and I just thought he was fantastic in that one.
I liked him in The Martian.
Yeah, I dislike him so much. I was rooting for Mars to kill him.
Really? Damn.
Yes.
Why do you hate Matt Damon so much? We've never had this conversation.
I just something of. All right, I will say I did like him, the talented Mr. Ripley, but usually, I don't think he's that good of an actor. I don't say this often, but he truly does, for me, have a punchable face, and he just aggravates me. I can't.
There's a certain smugness to him, for sure. At the same time, he is at least a fan of Howard Zinn, so he's got that going for him.
That's cool and all. They were next door neighbors, I heard, or at least he grew up and Howard Zinn was next door neighbor. I've got problems with Howard Zinn. At least my view of Howard Zinn is that, once the Industrial Revolution happens, as a historian, he's a bit better, if you will. But pre-Industrial Revolution, I don't like his work. I don't think it really works at all. His chapter in the American Revolution, the People's History of the United States, I think is maybe the worst chapter in the entire book. I think it's an example of somebody really missing the point. But that's either here nor there. We've been talking about Mel Gibson. We've been talking about Mel Gibson's films. We've been talking about Howard Zinn.
Yeah, usually we save this kind of shit for the end, but I guess today we decided to get it out early.
I guess, man. Well, maybe we'll have some fun stuff at the end for you guys anyway.
Last time we had an epilogue. This time we had a prologue. So there you go.
Yeah. I do want to mention one thing with these Koei games to everybody, though. Just one quick aside. Liberty or Death, if you ever want to play this, you're a retro gamer or whatnot, it's a great game. And in one regard, it's great history because they have so many obscure American and British officers, like guys whose names I've run into in that game. And there's one of them I only just found him 2 months ago. I was reading about the Battle of Hobkirk's Hill, and there he was. I was like, holy hell, there's the guy,
Yeah.
But the way the game operates, the British Army is very much inferior and has very good ambush units. So it's kind of the roles are reversed. If you play the British, it's actually more like playing as the Americans during the Revolution, as more like the Americans historically. So this game simultaneously has a great historical feel to it, and at the same time is absolutely the worst simulation of the American Revolution I've ever seen.
Yeah. I imagine, I don't know what the best Koei game is. I know your favorite's probably Genghis Khan 2.
Yeah, that's my fave.
I'm personally, the game I've played more than any other game in my entire life is Romance of the Three Kingdoms 10 for PS2. I've probably logged at least 200 hours in that game over the course of over a decade at this point. Yeah, fantastic game. Also, the Dynasty Tactics games, and then the Dynasty Warriors, especially the classic ones like Dynasty Warriors 3. When I was in high school, my last couple of years, I played the absolute shit out of those games. So yeah, because my favorite genre are turn-based tactical games. So the two Dynasty Tactics games, I would put together some sick-ass combos on that, and I unlocked all the little endings that you can get with every faction. And I'm usually not much of a completionist, but with that game I was.
I got to say, just for me, my favorite genre has got to be first-person shooters. Just love Half-Life series, Wolfenstein 3D, Doom. I don't know, just love them.
I like FPS too. The two genres I dislike are racing and platforming.
Yeah, platforming's a tough one. Although I like when people are good at it, I got a lot of respect for them. Yeah, I'm not much on racing. I don't like the party game stuff.
Yeah, I hate party games. I hate any kind of button masher. I mean, I don't have very quick reflexes, so for me, that's a guaranteed L. And there's nothing I can do about it. So, it's pointless and frustrating.
But let's go ahead and start off with our cast of Brits here,
All right. So, first up, we have John Burgoyne.
Yes, John Burgoyne is my favorite British general of the war. That doesn't mean he's the best, by the way. In fact, far from it. But he's my favorite. Fascinating man. He's one of the only guys in this list where I've read a full-scale John Burgoyne biography, cover to cover. So a few things about John Burgoyne. He came from a distinguished but kind of impoverished British family. Was an officer pretty early on, went in the military life. However, he had problems. He was an alcoholic, a womanizer, and a gambler. And I'd probably say gambling was the biggest of those three vices. So the fact that he had a lot of financial difficulties delayed his promotions. Understand that the British had what's called the purchase system. For you to become an officer, you had to purchase the rank. Now, keep in mind that this sounds like, it makes the British into an aristocracy, oligarchic aristocracy. That's what the intention is. They only want people from the aristocracy in the ranks. That is intentional. That said, you could have members of the middle class who could become officers as well, but they would rarely get past the rank of major or anything. At the same time, it must be said that even if you could purchase your rank, doesn't necessarily mean they're going to give you a plum assignment. So, I mean, just because you have a bunch of aristocrats around here doesn't mean everybody's an idiot. In the case of John Burgoyne, he very much impressed George II and William Pitt. First off, he was he oversaw a brilliant campaign in Portugal towards the end of the 7 Years' War. He was known as a drill master and a military reformer. His military reforms are considered almost revolutionary for their time. What he believed in was that the Britain's tradition of iron discipline must be maintained, but must also be tempered with better treatment of the soldiers, including, and this is the one that's big, he said acknowledge them as individuals. So Burgoyne's idea was not that you would be chummy with the men, but that you were willing to go up to them and talk to them by the campfire just a bit. That you would try to remember individual soldiers' names. That you would try to give them some kind of rewards for what they're doing. So he is, honest to God, beloved by the British rank and file. Probably one of, not the most popular general in the British Army when the Revolution starts. Didn't really want to go to America. He did so only at the behest of King George III. Interestingly enough, he was older than both Howe and Clinton, but junior in rank, because remember, he had failed to purchase some of his ranks beforehand. I mean, he had the financial difficulties that had prevented quick promotion. He took part in the Canadian campaign in 1776, and then he went back to Britain and he schemed to get a command where he would invade New York, north. So he undermined his commander, Guy Carleton. His plan was that he would lead a column of roughly 10,000 men down the Hudson River, while William Howe would go up the Hudson River. They would meet in Albany. They would therefore cut off New England from the rest of the colonies, and they believed New England was where the rebellion started. New England was the heart and soul of it. Cut off New England, and the rebellion will fail. The army that Burgoyne brought with him was a very interesting army. It was made up of loyalist militia, some of the first being utilized by a British army, indigenous scouts and warriors. Who else was there? Oh, of course, British regulars, some Hessians, a lot of Brunswickers, which was another German principality that sold troops to them. So a very unusual army, too. One of the other unusual things is that he brought a lot of artillery with him. That's because Burgoyne had witnessed Bunker Hill, and he figured the Americans were good at entrenching, because keep in mind, your average American is what back then? A farmer. Right. What are farmers good at?
Building stuff.
Digging, building stuff. So he brought a massive artillery train with him because he expected he would run into a fortified American position that he'd have to blast to pieces. This massive artillery train proved to be one of his downfalls. His march through the woods of northern New York was slow and ponderous. Now, it should be said he did have early success capturing Fort Ticonderoga. The campaign, though, unraveled. William Howe didn't attack New York against Albany, so Burgoyne finds himself kind of cast in the wind, if you will. He attacked the Americans at Freeman's Farm and won a Pyrrhic victory. But here's the problem. After he wins Freeman's Farm, it's obvious that it's not the kind of battle that's going to force the Americans out of their defensive position at Saratoga. I'm sorry, not at Saratoga, my bad, at Bemis Heights. So he's got to figure, what am I going to do? He has an idea. He'll wait and see what happens. Now, keep this in mind. Burgoyne's a gambler. He not only had gambled his entire career on pulling this off, he had even placed a bet with Charles James Fox that his campaign would be successful. Fox, the politician, bet against him.
Yeah, I think today, if that came to light, there would be a trial.
Oh, yeah. But, I mean, this is the period of Britain from roughly 1770 to about 1820 or 30 is notorious for its license in terms of, gambling is everywhere. You have alcoholism is through the roof. Just about every noble we're going to be told on this list is having multiple affairs. Okay? So, in fact, there's a whole argument made the reason the Victorian age was the way it was, that their kids saw their parents and said they're disgusting. And he's really one of the first, he's one on the forefront of this thing. But anyway, so, that would be a big scandal nowadays. We found out one of the head politicians bet against the other guy, right?
Oh, yeah.
But they would say it's a friendly bet amongst gentlemen. That's what they would tell you.
And then they'd tell the public to bugger off and stay out of their business.
Exactly. And, you don't even get to vote anyway, so who cares?
Yeah. Well,
Burgoyne waited, and nothing good happened. The Americans retook Fort Ticonderoga. William Howe left Henry Clinton to do the attack up the Hudson, but he didn't give Clinton enough men to go very far. I mean, Clinton did have success because he's a very good commander, but he couldn't go that far. And so Burgoyne really finds himself out in a limb, and so what he decides to do is he tries to outflank the American position. That maneuver not only fails, the Americans counterattack and storm part of the British position. The British then have to retreat towards Saratoga, where Burgoyne surrenders. Here's the thing, though. Burgoyne surrenders so that his men will have good terms, because the way he saw it, he could keep on fighting, but he wanted to get his men good terms. Remember, he really does care about his men. He secured very good terms for the British army. we violated those terms. And actually, a number of British soldiers will die in America because of the poor conditions for prisoners of war. Should also be noted, though, that the British conditions for American prisoners of war were horrible. It's a war crime. What they did what the British did with the Americans is they put them on these prison hulk ships. So essentially, they would just be wasting away on boats. It's absolutely horrific.
And weren't most of those boats in New York Harbor? Or?
Yes. I think there's some in Charleston as well. A lot of Americans, though, said, okay, whatever, I'll swear loyalty to the crown. Do you know where they sent those guys? The Caribbean.
Oh, boy. Well, actually, that's not a bad deal. It's like a free vacation.
You say that, but, if you're not used to it, I mean, yellow fever strikes in, and the next thing you know, you're dead. I mean...
That's true.
In fact, there's an argument to be made that the British really screwed up at the end of the 7 Years' War because all those regiments in North America that had gained a lot of experience were then sent to Cuba, where many of them just died of yellow fever. In fact, if you ever want to read about one of the worst disasters in British military history, read about their attack on Cartagena during the War of Jenkins' Ear. The British landed a force of 12,000 men. 9,000 of them died of yellow fever.
Damn.
And other diseases.
Yeah, actually, we should save that idea for the military boondoggle series I was talking about.
Yeah, that'd be a good one, man. That'd be a good one,
Yeah, because that sounds pretty fucking terrible.
I think I might do Cartagena for Forgotten Battles.
I think it's Cartagena.
Cartagena, sorry, yeah. Don't go to me for pronunciation. And anybody who comments about that on YouTube, know that I do not care. Anyway, John Burgoyne. Oh, fun fact about him. When he returned Britain, now before this he'd been a Tory. Tories shunned him and blamed him for the defeat. The Whigs, though, embraced him and used him politically against Lord North's government. Lord North is the British Prime Minister. That's fascinating. Think about it. Like, when he came back, he wasn't universally jeered. A bunch of people said it wasn't your fault. You tried your best. And he became, like, when they would say the war is poorly managed, they'd say, look at this. One of our finest officers was undermined, wasn't properly supported. That's why he lost. And he'd be up there to give you a speech saying the exact same thing. And in some ways, Burgoyne could even be called like the Donald Trump principle of that, where, he didn't admit failure or say, I'm sorry. He went before Parliament and said, this guy screwed me over, and you guys can go to hell.
Huh.
And it worked.
Well,
other fun fact, Burgoyne was a playwright, a successful playwright, and that's maybe one of the reasons why there's actually a George Bernard Shaw play where he's one of the characters.
Interesting.
So Burgoyne, fascinating man. I really like him. He seems the kind of guy I'd like to hang out with. I always have a thing for military reformers. They're one of my favorite types of military commanders, really, because they tend to be, intellectual and forward-thinking, if you will. That said, Burgoyne seems to have been a good cavalry tactician. As an infantry tactician, not so great. Tend to divide his forces too much. He did have great leadership skills, though, at least definitely with the common soldiers. I think there's a lot of faults with the New York plan. It's hard. I want to go D or E with him. What do you think, Derek, based on what I've told you?
Man. Well, if we're talking about his military career overall, you could possibly go as high as C because of the reforms. We're talking about just the American War for Independence. Pretty much a D or an E. I mean, maybe even an E. He clearly screwed the pooch on his invasion.
He did, although I must say he really was expecting William Howe to be attacking up the Hudson.
Oh, I guess that's kind of an extenuating circumstance. Also, I guess Howe wasn't really that great either.
We'll get to Howe eventually. Howe is probably the most debated general in all the British generals. I'm gonna go with an E.
Okay.
I hate doing it, but I got to go with an E.
Yeah, and that's it's also interesting. There are plenty of commanders who are terrible at their jobs, but yet were sympathetic, likable, and intelligent people. I remember reading a book about Gallipoli, and the British commander, Ian Hamilton, sounds like a pretty cool guy. And, a very smart guy, but holy shit did he bungle that.
Yeah.
So I guess he's sort of like the Burgoyne of a later age.
Ambrose Burnside would be another example for the Civil War.
Yeah.
Yeah, and by the way, everybody, I'm going to rate these people based only on what they did in the American Revolution, because as you'll see, a few of these guys had very good 7 years war career. In fact, Burgoyne had a very good career in the 7 Years' War.
Also, a number of them, at least two of them that I can name right off the top of my head, served in India and did pretty well.
Yeah. We'll get to Cornwallis, of course. But let's move on to our next guy, Guy Carleton.
Yep. This is someone I have never heard of before.
Fun fact, though, in Liberty or Death, he is like the greatest commander in the entire game.
Really?
Yeah, he has like the highest ratings of anybody, like combined ratings. Because in the game, they rate you for like discipline, tactics, and leadership, and body points. He's in the 90s in all of those things.
Damn.
The high 90s too. He's insane. Guy Carleton is the Terminator of Liberty or Death.
Although I'm pretty sure Nathaniel Greene is the only person with a 100 for tactics, right?
Yes, either him or Clinton, 100 in tactics. But yeah, I mean Greene's very good too. Greene's the second Terminator, I guess you would say, But anyway, I just wanted to say that because Guy Carleton is a beast in that game.
Yeah, see, I would be more familiar with the ratings in that game, but one time I tried to order the Super Nintendo copy, and some motherfucker off of eBay sent me Clue.
Oh my god.
Do you remember that? Because we were in Kentucky at the time. I remember telling you about it, and I probably spent about 5 minutes of just pure profanity explaining it. Because I spent about $25 or $30, which Super Nintendo games were cheaper a decade ago, by the way, for anyone who's wondering. Not only that, but I don't like Clue, so this was completely useless to me, although I still have it, so...
Carleton is a bit of a complicated officer. Oh, by the way, wait, how is Clue for SNES? Is it good?
I mean, it sucks ass. Just like the Genesis version is fucking terrible. Just like the board game itself, but...
Hey, Risk is good on Genesis, right?
It is. I've never played Risk on SNES. I don't even know if it's on there, but my favorite version of Risk is the PlayStation 1 version. Which is the same as the PC version. It has the little animations, and you can choose your little tactical cards. And you can develop generals.
Carleton was James Wolfe's quartermaster during the capture of Quebec, so he was recognized to have very good organizational talents. Could be a bit on the blunt side, but he was also brave. Became Governor General of Canada in 1770. Interestingly enough, he becomes fairly popular in Canada because he supported the locals over government officials, over like British high government officials. But this also made him unpopular back in Britain. Well, that said, when the American Revolution starts, Guy Carleton is interesting. He failed to raise the militia. He chose not to use the indigenous to raid the Americans. He tried to hold Fort St. John, which cost him the entire Canadian garrison. At that point, almost the entirety of Canada had been overrun. The British are backed into a corner at Quebec. And when they're backed into a corner, suddenly Guy Carleton goes from being dithering and making nothing but mistakes to suddenly he does literally everything right. He raised the locals, he strengthens the defenses, tells the men we are never giving this city up, and then in a very brutal battle in the middle of winter, Quebec holds the city. He then, with British reinforcements, counterattacks, retakes Canada. His pursuit was a bit sluggish, but he did win a battle at Three Rivers. But his invasion of northern New York at this time to try to secure Fort Ticonderoga fails. Burgoyne undermines him, and so Carleton stays in command of Canada, but not in charge of the army that will invade Canada from the north, that being Burgoyne's army. Now, Carleton's kind of interesting during the Canadian invasion. He knows that Burgoyne had undermined him, but he did everything he could to make sure Burgoyne had proper logistical support and enough troops. But once the campaign started and Burgoyne would say, hey, could you maybe send me a few extra men? Carleton was like, nope. So he did everything he could to help Burgoyne until Burgoyne's invasion started. For that reason, he was replaced in Canada the next year in 1778. That being said, he is the final commander-in-chief of the British forces in America. He replaces Henry Clinton in 1782, which is essentially just him overseeing the British evacuation.
Ah.
Yeah. Carleton was arrogant. He could be cold and insubordinate. I wouldn't call him imaginative. He did have organizational skills and bravery, and his leadership at Quebec is one of the finest moments any British officer ever had during the entire conflict. It is hard to rate him, though, for that reason, because he has this one stellar moment, but he didn't really do very good before that, even really after that, actually, which is hilarious since he's such a beast in Liberty or Death.
Yeah.
I think I got to go with a D, Carleton. I go with a D.
So pretty important to the history of Canada, but not on the same level as Zap Rousdower.
Not on the same level as Zap Rousdower. Or John Candy, or a variety of other great Canadians. Neil Young. Yeah, Bret the Hitman Hart. What else? Alex Trebek, Michael J. Fox.
William Shatner.
Oh my God, I forgot about Shatner. Yeah, he's the greatest Canadian of all time.
All right. Well, speaking of Henry Clinton, he is next.
Oh yeah, another one of these really complicated figures from the war. Henry Clinton's fun though. His family could trace its origins back to 1066. They came over with They came over with William the Conqueror. He was actually born into a family. His father was an admiral who was governor of New York. So he grew up in Canada and America. Grew up in Newfoundland and New York. And he served in the colonial militia before he actually joined the British Army. He was able to rise in the ranks very quickly because his family had political connections and a lot of money.
Because you had to buy your commissions back then.
Exactly, and he had the money to do it. Now, that said, Clinton was also a very, very blunt man. He can be very difficult to work with. He actually described himself as a shy bitch. That's his exact words. And that's one of the fun things about Clinton is his letters to his sisters and his diary show a man who is extremely honest and forthcoming with his emotions. An era where that just isn't.
Do you think he was like that in person too, or just in his diaries and letters?
No, there's a lot of accounts that he was like that in person. He just wasn't an easy guy to work with. Also, another fun fact, very unsuccessful with women, but he loved prostitutes.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, with all that money, he's helping to sustain the local economy, so...
Yeah, I think there's one story that when he got to Boston, in 1775, one of his first questions was essentially like, where are the whores? But that's I'm saying these things. And you're like, oh god, he must be terrible. But he's a great planner, a superb tactician. He had served under Ferdinand of Brunswick in the 7 Years' War. Ferdinand of Brunswick was sent to the Rhine theater where he fought the French successfully for several years. So Clinton really learned under one of the best of the era. And he also learned about the Prussian military system. So he's considered within the British Army to also be an expert on Prussia's system. And Prussia at this time is the kind of like the idol of the European armies. They consider the pinnacle, the best. So anyway, he's sent to America. He does become friends with Burgoyne and Thomas Gage, who we'll get to later. At Bunker Hill, he led a reinforcement that helped win the battle. And keep that in mind, Bunker Hill is a very costly British victory, but it is a victory. If the British had lost at Bunker Hill, they would have had to abandon Boston. it would have been the kind of setback that I'm not sure they could have recovered from. But anyway, that's near here and there. We're not talking about the battles in that much detail. He did very well in the New York campaign, but by that time, William Howe, who didn't really like him anyway, because he had befriended Thomas Gage. Well, Howe didn't like Gage, so he's kind of like, hey, this guy Clinton is friends with my rival, at least in the early part of the war. So Howe Clinton was sent by Howe to capture Newport, Rhode Island, instead of being sent to chase George Washington. And when Howe went to go take Philadelphia, he left Clinton in New York. Clinton did try to help out Burgoyne. He did win some battles, but he didn't have enough men to go far enough. So it was decided in 1778 to replace Howe with Clinton. Clinton evacuates the army to New York City, then oversees the implementation of what's called the Southern Strategy. And to that end, he does oversee the crucial victory at Charleston. And the American forces there are surrounded and the city captured. The worst defeat the Americans will suffer in the entire war. 5,000 Americans are captured. I think at this point, Clinton makes a mistake. He doesn't stay in the South. He leaves Cornwallis there. By that time, him and Cornwallis were openly feuding. And that's probably Clinton's biggest weakness, is he's just bad at personnel man. Not good at that sort of bickered with all the admirals that were sent over. Although, to be fair, a lot of the British admirals sent to North America were not finest that Britannia's produced. His strategy became one of coastal raids. He granted slaves freedom for military service. Oh, by the way, the coastal raids, the granting of slaves military freedom for military service, it's part of Clinton's overall idea that one of the ways to beat the Americans is to try to destroy their economy. And in some ways, he's right. The American economy by 1781 is very, very weak. And both John Adams and George Washington were confined to each other. They didn't think they thought without a sudden victory that they would lose the war. So overall, Clinton is a very good strategist. But then he failed fast enough to relieve Yorktown. For that, he was blamed for Yorktown. Cornwallis wasn't, and Clinton was removed. He will spend the rest of his life trying to vindicate himself, and only towards the very end of his life did he get some vindication, was returned to command. Oh, fun fact, both of his sons became generals in the Napoleonic Wars. One in particular, William Clinton was not, no, Henry Clinton. Actually, another guy, another name, Henry Clinton. His son, Henry, fought with Wellington in several battles, including Toulouse, Salamanca, and most importantly, Waterloo, where he led one of the main divisions. So Henry Clinton, kind of hard to rate. He's a very talented tactician, a gifted strategist. He had really just had a lot of problems working with other people. I wouldn't even say he was that popular with the men either. But that said, under his watch, the British did very well until 1781. And I would argue that a lot of the failures that lead to the British losing the war didn't have to do with Clinton as much as they do with Cornwallis. So I personally give Clinton a C.
Okay. The C stands for Clinton.
Indeed. What do you think of Henry Clinton based on what I said?
He always has come across as a capable guy, but it never seems like he really got a major chance to demonstrate his talents. He never got a decisive battle with Washington. I feel like his reputation may have been burnished if Washington had actually launched that grand assault on New York and he'd had the chance to have a full-out battle, but that never occurred, so yeah, never had a chance.
No, he didn't.
Also, it had probably been am I right to say that it would have been a complete catastrophe if Washington had tried to assault New York in 1781?
Probably. The story on that is that Washington was prepared to do it because, remember, he thinks they're going to lose the war. So even though they're starting to win some battles in the South, Washington's like, oh my God, I can barely keep my army together. Mutinies are happening. The economy is a shambles. So literally, it's a desperation. But then it's really the French. It's really Rochambeau who goes to Washington and says, dude, we have a chance at Yorktown to really pull something. And it actually took some convincing for George to go, you know what, this whole New York idea, it's stupid. I'm out of here.
Yeah, so I feel so it sounds like Clinton's strategy was actually more or less working. And then Cornwallis, of course, got cut off, and then Washington decided to abandon a very bad idea. So I guess had things played out a little differently, we might be talking about Henry Clinton as an A or S tier.
Yeah, that's possible. I will say one thing though: that the Southern strategy, Clinton implemented it and oversaw its biggest success at Charleston. But it would be an overstatement to say that it was his idea. It was more the idea of Lord George Germain, Sackville, if you will. He was kind of the grand strategist of the American Revolution, and he's probably one of, if not the most controversial figures of the entire conflict. And Germain proved to be in many ways a very adept strategist, but he was also a hard guy to get along with. He consistently doubted the Americans' abilities in the battlefield. And to be fair, there are plenty of battles where the Americans did horrible. I mean, the British attack on Savannah is one of the worst defeats an American force has ever suffered. We barely even shot the British. We ran. So, to be fair to Germain, he would get a report like that, and he'd be like, see, I told you they're worthless. But then I'm like, yeah, but then you get Freeman's Farm. So if you got in a well-trained American force with a good general, they can beat you. So, Clinton, I could see that. I'll go with the C, though, because his ability to work with others, it really is a train wreck.
Yeah.
It really is a train wreck.
Does not play well with others.
Does not coordinate well with others, either as a subordinate or as a superior.
The C also stands for coordination, lack thereof. All right, so speaking of people whose name begin with C, and also people who Henry Clinton did not get along with super well, Charles Cornwallis.
Yes, Lord Cornwallis, a fascinating guy. He was a Whig, and him and George III, interesting enough, had a friendship. A fairly close one, which is interesting because Cornwallis opposed George III in almost everything political. But that might be because in an era where, you got these nobles and they're drinking, gambling, and fornicating, he didn't really do any of that. I mean, well, Cornwallis and George would have a drink, right? But they weren't gamblers. As far as we can tell, George III probably never cheated on his wife.
Wow.
He seems to have done a little bit of that kind of stuff before he married her, but I haven't seen the evidence for it afterwards. And that, honestly, by the way, made George III very popular with a lot of Brits at the time. So Cornwallis was not really a man of his time socially, and I think George III just liked that about him. He opposed the Stamp Act. In fact, I think it was a thing where I believe there's something where they said that Cornwallis at first told his constituents that he would never go to America, but then when given the chance, he went anyway. He very quickly formed a friendship with William Howe, who, to be fair, William Howe was also a political Whig and an opponent of George III and Lord North. Anyway, what Cornwallis is known for is that he was sent into New Jersey to chase Washington. He didn't catch him. And then when Washington took Trenton, Cornwallis is the one sent to fight him. Cornwallis attacked Washington outside of Trenton at a place called like Aspunk Creek or something, Aspunick or something. It's a battle a lot of people don't talk about, which is interesting because it's an American victory. The British attack and they're defeated and suffer some heavy losses. Then Washington marched around Cornwallis and won the Battle of Princeton.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize there was a battle between Trenton and Princeton.
Exactly. It's kind of interesting. Nobody talks about this battle between the two, but not only was that battle in terms of raw casualties was bloodier than Trenton or Princeton, because Trenton has a lot of prisoners. That's mostly what the Hessian casualty count is, prisoner. So this is in terms of killed and wounded, a bloodier battle than those. But anyway, Cornwallis had been marched around, but Howe still liked him. He did pretty well in the Philadelphia campaign. And he accompanied Clinton to Charleston. Now, by this time, Cornwallis is depressed. Remember, he's a family man. His wife had died. And he didn't like serving under Clinton. So he was kind of saying, hey, can I leave? They were like, nope, can't do that. Clinton left Cornwallis in charge in South Carolina. The orders were to pacify. Understand that the British had already retaken Georgia. Reinstalled the governor. British controlled the Georgia interior for the most part, so they want to do the same thing in South Carolina. The problem is Cornwallis doesn't really have a mind or the patience for pacification, for dealing with partisans. He's very much a guy who's like, look, I just want to fight armies. And he's given that chance at the Battle of Camden, one of the worst defeats the Americans will ever suffer. Shatters their flank. That said, after Camden, after winning this major victory, Cornwallis doesn't do much right. Fails to support Patrick Ferguson, which leads to King's Mountain. He invaded North Carolina and was turned back. Then he invaded a second time, chased Greene all the way to Guilford, and won in a very bloody battle there, one of the bloodiest of the war. One of the most infamous things he did at Guilford was, while the Americans are about to break through, he orders artillery to fire canister into them. But the point he ordered them to fire canister, some of his own men were in the way.
Damn.
The canister shots did turn back the Americans, but they killed a bunch of his own soldiers as well. That should be kept in mind, too. Cornwallis was not a popular figure with the rank and file. This guy's not Burgoyne or William Howe.
So, from what I understand, Cornwallis was relatively young compared to a lot of these other guys. He was only in maybe his mid to late 30s at this time.
Yeah. One thing that's interesting about him was he didn't really support the Loyalists too much. He had this obsession with invading North Carolina because he thought it would cut off American support in South Carolina. Like, the supplies are going through North Carolina, take over North Carolina. Once the North Carolina invasion fails, he then decides to invade Virginia. And I consider this the biggest blunder of the war. Because he invades Virginia when he hasn't destroyed Greene's army. Now, keep in mind, Greene's army was in bad shape after Guilford Courthouse. So he wasn't able to do a hard campaign for a number of weeks. But Cornwallis just ignores them. There's an American army that's still active. You have partisans overrunning South Carolina, and he says, I'm not interested in that. Let's go to Virginia. And part of the reason he goes to Virginia is because there are some British soldiers there under Benedict Arnold. They've been raiding the coast. And, he then manages to get himself bottled up at Yorktown. And when the army surrenders, he doesn't have the guts to go to Washington and give away his sword. He sends his second-in-command, Charles O'Hara, to do it.
Yeah, why did he enter the Virginia Peninsula? Because there's no escape from there unless you have ships. I mean, did he even know the Navy was nearby?
I think for the British, they're thinking we'll be resupplied by sea. And keep in mind, while the French had been active, they hadn't been that active. The French sent a fleet over in 1779 that failed to take Newport and then failed to take Savannah. So I think in his mind, I think he was kind of like shocked to see the French show up, if you will.
Ah.
I'm not too clear on that one, but what he was thinking is, I'll be resupplied by sea, and at the point that he's at Yorktown, he has a large British army, 8,000 soldiers. So almost double the number of men that Burgoyne had at Saratoga when he surrendered. So with that Yorktown force, what he was hoping to do in Virginia was, because he believed that Virginia was the most populous and prosperous of Southern colonies, so he believed that if he could subdue Virginia, that would thereby cancel out what the Americans were doing in South Carolina. Once again, the idea of like, I'll cut off their supplies if you... It's just moronic. I mean, while he's doing this, the British in South Carolina are being turned back. Their outposts are being seized. The partisans overrun the area.
Because doesn't Greene take his army and invade South Carolina after he realizes that Cornwallis has marched north?
Yeah, exactly. He's like, whatever, they'll send men to deal with them. I'll just go to South Carolina. I mean, it's so stupid. I mean, it's some boneheaded shit.
So, also with the Southern campaign in general, wasn't the South a little bit stronger for the crown than the Middle states in the North? Or
Yes,
okay,
Cornwallis hadn't done enough to support the Loyalists, and the Loyalist cause. I mean, you have battles at Kettle Creek where a bunch of Georgia Loyalists were defeated and scattered, but Kings Mountain really did hurt the Loyalist cause. Loyalist recruitment went far down. But that said, you can still get them. In fact, there was a North Carolina Loyalist uprising in 1781 that did some serious damage, led by a guy named David Fanning.
yeah,
Cornwallis has that victory at Camden, and he was typically pretty good, and actually pretty good at under Howe. And I will say, when he was sent to the rest of his career was very good as well. He did some actions in India, where successful as both the commander and administrator. He helped suppress the Irish Revolution of 1798, or revolt, however you want to look at it. Also, he did sign the peace treaty with Napoleon in 1802.
Oh, wasn't he also considered for the Peninsula Command at one point?
No, too elderly by that point.
Okay, Tarleton was considered.
Tarleton was considered. We'll get to him. Yeah. I think Cornwallis, his heart really wasn't in the war. I mean, keep in mind, he was a Whig. He had been opposed to what they were doing in the American colonies. I think of all the British officers on this list, his heart was the one least in the conflict. When he was fighting the South, he was depressed. That dealt with it, that hampered his judgment. He was very successful after the American Revolution, but during the American Revolution, I mean, what's our lowest tier on this thing? E?
F.
I got to go with E for Cornwallis.
Okay.
Or maybe a D. He's not an F because he wins Camden. He's pretty good under Howe. It's just
yeah. Also, clarification on Guilford Courthouse. Was that a Pyrrhic victory for Cornwallis, or was that a pretty legit win which weakened Greene more than Cornwallis?
Pyrrhic victory. Cornwallis lost more men. His army was in worse condition afterwards. It has to be counted victory because not only did he hold the field, but yeah, Greene's army was not in good shape. That has to be made clear. Because a lot of people make Guilford Courthouse sound like, oh, the Americans practically won. I'm like, no. Greene was not happy with Guilford Courthouse for good reason. And while the raw casualties were lower, Greene's army suffered a lot of desertions after Guilford. So I do count Guilford Courthouse as a true Pyrrhic victory. And the thing about a Pyrrhic victory is, they just... you can almost call them a draw, if you will, because the result could have been worse, right?
Right.
For the Brits, the result definitely could have been worse. For one thing, they're outnumbered during the battle.
And weren't they also? I mean, they advanced into a prepared position.
Yeah, but when we say prepared position, it wasn't exactly like entrenchments like at Bunker Hill.
And I guess to be fair, Greene's first two lines were militia, so they were ordered to fire a volley or two and run.
Something like that, but even Greene complained the militia didn't quite do their jobs on the second line. The first line did pretty well, though.
Yeah, I think the Virginians did more than they were asked, and then the North Carolinians in the second line did less.
Exactly. So Greene, one should not think that after Guilford Courthouse, Greene was like, yippee! He was more like, oh, that I did, because Greene wasn't looking for a Pyrrhic, wasn't looking to have a Pyrrhic British victory. He's looking for an American victory.
Right.
Yeah. Also, Cornwallis added the backbiting with Clinton. He intrigued against him. He wasn't even particularly popular with his men. Yeah, I gotta go with an E.
That makes sense. Because I know he's normally portrayed as being a really capable general. Maybe he's a decent tactician in a pitched battle, but that's mainly really his only skill. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, but then again, he goes sent to India where he has to be an administrator and a commander, and he does well.
I guess maybe he learned something from his experience in the Americas, or maybe it was just an easier task.
I don't know about it being easier or harder. I don't know enough about the conflict. I've just known that he's always praised for his actions in India, and maybe if I looked into it, I'd find out that's inaccurate. He's may have been.
I mean, that's what I've always heard too. Is that he was pretty much like Wellington in India. Yeah, he was kicking ass and taking names.
He had actually more responsibility than Wellington in India. Wellington in India just kind of had responsibility over military affairs. Cornwallis had to juggle a lot.
Yeah, either that or maybe he had a hidden talent for whatever. Either he had a great staff that we don't know much about.
Right. I think we can say about Cornwallis in America is that he was depressed. His heart was never quite in the conflict. He didn't like Clinton at all, and he's serving under him, taking orders from him. And it's fair to say he probably learned from that experience and did that much better in India.
Yeah.
So, once again, guys, rating him purely based on American experience, but his blunders post Guilford are galling, and his actual management of the theater after Camden is really bad.
Also, random question. I might have asked you this before. My dad claims when he's in high school he read a book by Cornwallis, a memoir about the campaign in the Carolinas. Is that a real thing? Because I've never found any trace of this existing, but my dad claims that he read it.
Honestly, I don't know about it, but it would make sense. It might have just been a defense of his actions. You know, I mean, Clinton wrote a military memoir, which is mostly a defense of his actions in America. So there is that.
All right. Well, next up we have Major Patrick Ferguson.
Yeah, one of your faves. I'm going to grab some water here, but why don't you, because Patrick Ferguson's somebody you know some stuff about, why don't you tell everybody what you know about old Ferg?
All right, so Patrick Ferguson was someone who was relatively junior in rank as a major, but he was still internationally famous, and he also had skills which went beyond being merely a soldier. He apparently had developed his own rifle. He also was an innovator in tactics, and his career was on the rise. He was often entrusted with some independent commands. He was popular among militias of loyalists, and his most famous moment, unfortunately for him, is commanding at King's Mountain, where he was mostly leading loyalists, and there was some sort of a blood feud that had happened due to either a British or a loyalist massacre, and a bunch of Scots-Irish Americans, or maybe they were just Scotsmen who had settled in America from the mountains of North Carolina, came down to avenge the death of some kinsman. And they were just looking for one bloodletting of the British. They happened to locate Ferguson's column at King's Mountain. They surrounded him, cut him off, and then butchered his entire command. But aside from that, his record was pretty good up to that point, and had he not been the guy on the westernmost flank of Cornwallis's army, most likely he would have gone on to have a very successful and long career, possibly even achieving fame, becoming some sort of reformer, but that never came to pass. I don't know about his ancestry. Maybe he didn't have quite the pedigree to ever really go too far in the British Army, but certainly he did a lot with what he did have.
Yeah, he had a leg ailment, if you will, and his family was not particularly wealthy, but he was very intelligent, very well-read man. Yeah, he's a bit interesting. Cornwallis kind of ignored his efforts in South Carolina. It was like, yeah, go do your loyalist thing, And it wasn't really until a few weeks before King's Mountain where Cornwallis was like, dude, I need your help, because he had also realized that Ferguson had raised like 1,000 loyalists, so this is the biggest loyalist force he had raised. But yeah, they were surrounded at King's Mountain. His tactics there were pretty bad overall, led to heavy losses. He died heroically, though, but of course, his body was mutilated. I think some of the people urinated on him or something, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, have you been to the site before?
Yeah, I've been there.
Yes, I mean, it's like this. It's basically a big round hill where you can literally surround it on all sides, and it's almost completely exposed with the exception of a few thin little trees. So basically, he and his men were in a shooting gallery.
Yeah, it should be noted he really didn't. I mean, he wasn't looking to fight at King's Mountain. He was trying to get out.
Yeah, and then it's just this huge rebel-aligned militia showed up looking for blood.
Yeah, should also be noted only British officer at the battle. In fact, arguably the only British soldier the entire battle. It's really an example of the American Revolution as our first Civil War, which I think it really is. My belief is that my general belief is that Americans tend towards civil war anyway. So take of that what you will.
Also, earlier you mentioned that about 20% of the American public was loyalist. What percentage was actually patriot?
I mean, actively?
Yeah, like in terms of people who either gave money or served or wrote something or whatever it might be, camp follower.
Yeah, that's kind of hard to tell, and it fluctuated a lot. Like very early in the American Revolution, they don't have problems raising troops. They have problems raising troops as the war goes on. There's that one book about Concord during the time. I think it's like The World of the Minutemen or something. What I thought was fascinating about the book was that the last chapter he talks about how after Concord, where the war had started, right? Talks about how Concord sent a lot of soldiers into the American army for the first 2 or 3 years. By 1781, they're trying not to pay their taxes, and barely anybody from the town is in Washington's army.
I remember, I don't know the exact number, but I remember when I had to write a paper on Guilford Courthouse, I was looking into the composition of the army, of the American army, I mean. And apparently a lot of the reason why the rebel militia tended to do the one volley and run is because many of the men were the sole providers for their families, and they were mostly living on subsistence farms. So they knew if they died, their family would literally starve.
Oh, yeah. Militia is in many ways a misunderstood thing in the American Revolution. There are a number of pitched battles where they did surprisingly well. Then there are other ones where they're a total disgrace. But like you said, I mean, they're sole providers to their family. They're not actually soldiers in that sense. Militia, though, did one very important thing. They're the guys who will do home defense and home policing. So if you want to suppress your local loyalist uprising, they're the guys who do it, sometimes brutally.
Wasn't Moores Creek Bridge an example of that?
Exactly. Another battle where there's not any Brits involved, really. It's Americans fighting Americans. Although, to be fair, most of the loyalists involved in that battle were recent arrivals.
Yeah, I remember my grandpa, my late grandfather, that is, was a huge fan of that battle because apparently the Patriots took all the planks off the bridge and then greased the metal parts. And supposedly some of these recent arrivals who were loyalists had Scottish claymores, and they were trying to cross the bridge under rifle fire with these big-ass swords on their backs. And, of course, that did not go super well for them.
No, it did not. Moores Creek Bridge is one of the most lopsided battles of a conflict known for lopsided battles.
Yeah.
The percentage would be hard to tell. My general theory is that the revolution started, people were excited. That excitement died down because of the smallpox epidemic, economic deprivations. I mean, the American economy does very poorly during this conflict, very poorly, because you have roving armies going around. You have conflict between loyalists and rebels. I hate when people say patriots. I'm always like, no, they're
whatever
rebels.
You want to call them, rebels, patriots,
I'm
traitors to the crown.
They're traitors to the crown. They are rebels. That is what they are. Stop trying to. I mean, look, I understand, guys. Everybody's like, Robert E. Lee was a traitor. I'm like, he's just doing what George Washington did. This is a country founded on treason. Simple as that. So the rebels and the loyalists are fighting each other, and then the British are blockading the ports. They're also raiding the coastal areas, especially when Clinton's in charge. So the American economy is doing horribly during this conflict. We're essentially funded by France.
Oh, to quote your favorite movie, The Patriot, Mel Gibson's character was initially very reluctant to get involved because he said that all we'd be doing by achieving independence is to trade one tyrant 1,000 miles away for 1,000 tyrants 1 mile away.
Actually, that's not an accurate sentiment that a lot of people had. I would say by the time you get to 1779, 1780, the majority of Americans have declared neutrality during this conflict.
I think another thing I read once was that over 60% of Americans really didn't give a shit about the outcome of the war. They just wanted it to end.
Yeah. Now, that said, they weren't willing to go with the loyalists, one must say. But think of those. I mean, if you want to think about, like, as extremists, because, extremists will be like, oh, moderates don't matter. All that matters is extremes. You could say in the American Revolution that middle group that didn't really care was just waiting to see who would win. And whoever won, they would definitely embrace when it was over. So, of course, after the war, we created the myth, the virtuous, malicious citizenry that stood up against tyranny. And it's completely a myth. Now, were the Americans creating a government that was more egalitarian? Yes, in many ways, but not going as far as a lot of common people would have wanted. And I think that's what happened was that, in addition to that, a lot of people, as they realized that the American revolutionary leadership was not going to be creating things like universal male suffrage. I think only Pennsylvania really tried that. They just weren't interested all of a sudden. There wasn't any benefit to the revolution. Now, that said, in the realm of ideas and in terms of world history, yes, this revolution has a profound effect. But that's why I always view the American Revolution as simultaneously very radical and very conservative.
Yeah.
By the same token, I do believe the same thing about the French Revolution, but that's a whole other can of worms to get into. But that's because the French Revolution has different factions and different waves. Like, you have your constitutional monarchy section, you got your Jacobins, you have the Directory, then you get the Consulate, then you get Napoleon Bonaparte. So there's just the French Revolution, you essentially have several different forms of government just happening within about 25, 30 years.
Yeah.
Insane. But anyway,
so
getting back to...
one final side note while we're on the subject of the Southern Campaign. Apparently the desertion rate for Cornwallis's army was sky high, and a lot of the British veterans just kind of went to the frontier and settled down. There's one guy named Reed who apparently found a gold mine and became very wealthy, and everybody knew he was a veteran, but no one knew what side he was on, or they just assumed he was on the American side. So when he's an old man, maybe 1820-something, somebody does an interview with him, and they ask him about the Continental Army. He's like, what are you talking about? I was in Cornwallis's army. So...
Well, the British had that problem with the Hessians, because the Hessians, when they were in Pennsylvania, ran into, other Germans. And the Hessians in particular were very like, oh my God, this is the land of milk and honey. And by the way, that actually is one of the things that really enraged a lot of British officers and even soldiers when they got to America and saw how well we lived. They were like, wait, you guys are rebelling?
Yeah.
Like you run into that a lot of times with the British officer letters and other recollections. You'll just run into this idea that they thought that we were a bunch of petulant children. But anyway, so there's the Cornwallis's army also had a variety of desertions from the Irish units. Only they would sometimes join Greene's army. But anyway, Ferg. Kind of a hard one to rate, I guess. What do you think?
I think he was a capable commander who kind of got screwed over by circumstances. Also, he had nothing to do with the massacre that outraged all the Scots settled in the mountains. So, he was basically a victim of circumstance. I guess he probably could have performed a little better at Kings Mountain, but still, who would have predicted thousands of men materializing from the west, which was basically like this... frontier, unsettled hellhole, and then all of a sudden you have thousands of men there for a blood feud. So, I feel like he kind of got screwed by circumstance more so than did anything wrong.
Yeah, one thing I like about Kings Mountain is that's kind of viewed as the hillbilly, redneck pinnacle, if you will.
It sort of was.
It's like if you're you'll run into people in the mountains, and that to them that is a part of mountaineer legend.
See, I went to college in the mountains. No one ever talked about Kings Mountain.
Oh yeah, well you're also in North Carolina.
Well, yeah, but that was where the battle happened. But I guess technically South Carolina, but it's right on the border. It's pretty near Charlotte.
Oh no, I'm sorry. I'm talking about for generations after it, not nowadays.
Yeah, not now, but.
No. nobody see. Look, history doesn't get you any money, so they don't look. I taught grade school for a bit. History doesn't get you any money. Teach the test, and the test emphasizes STEM because we're trying to become the Soviet Union.
Yeah. Also, I've noticed that engineers and scientists, for all of their intelligence in their own fields, often lack critical thinking when it comes to, say, history, politics, things of that nature.
Yeah, I mean it's different type of stuff, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, look at Beauregard. Beauregard was a great engineer, but when it came to politics, he was a bonehead.
Yeah.
You know, I do mention that because when I say Soviet Union, I think when people like George W. Bush and Obama were really talking about science and math, that's what we got to emphasize. I'm like, that's the Soviet Union. That is the Soviet Union educational plan. I mean, hell, I was just watching a documentary on the making of Tetris, and they mentioned that they were like, kids in Russia couldn't like play video games or anything like that, but they could play. Some of the only toys they were allowed were board games and math games, preferably board games that would increase their mathematical and engineering skills.
Well, also, I feel like aren't most of the grandmasters of chess Russian?
Quite a few.
Yeah, a disproportionately high number, I would say.
Russia known for what? Ballet, chess, alcoholism,
And espionage.
Human rights abuses.
Yeah. And also those little egg things. The what are those called? You know, you have the little egg figures, and then you have smaller ones inside.
Yeah, I forgot, man.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on.
Right, so how do we rate Ferguson?
I kind of feel like maybe a D, or I think maybe a D. He when he was in the one battle he was in, he didn't do very well tactically. He did raise a bunch of loyalists, but then he also did things to piss off those mountain men by saying like, "I'm going to burn your homes" and stuff, which is also kind of funny because Ferguson strikes me as such a gentleman. I feel like he was mostly just like exaggerating what he was going to do. Like he thought maybe if I just talk up to these guys, they'll take me seriously. And no, it actually turns out they're going to urinate on you.
Yeah, I guess he had never met a redneck before.
Yeah, not too many people had.
Yeah, so I mean, I guess he was the discoverer of the redneck.
Yeah.
But anyway, I'm gonna take a quick personal break. I want to hear what you have to say about Thomas Gage, so maybe you could pitch Forgotten Battles for 2 minutes or so, and then I'll be right back.
Yeah, sure thing.
All right.
Well, that was a loud exit. But yeah, no, everybody, Forgotten Battles is a YouTube channel that me, my brother, and a friend Lance do, and Lance does the video editing and especially the music because he's a big audiophile. My brother does the narration; he writes some of the episodes, and then I write some episodes as well. What we try to do is talk about a wide variety of battles through history. We want to do battles that are important but are not as discussed as often. So, for instance, for the American Civil War, we've discussed actually 3 battles because Civil War story. And so we've done Wilson's Creek, Secessionville, and Stones River. I will never do Gettysburg on there because Gettysburg is the opposite of a forgotten battle. For World War II, we've also done 5 videos, 2 on the European theater, 3 on the Pacific. I'm a little more interested in the Pacific theater, so I like writing those. And we got a variety of other ones as well lined up. We've got a video right now. We got a video on the Vietnam War. We have a video on the Chickasaw Wars, which happened in Mississippi, what is today Mississippi. And that's essentially what we go for. We try to do a few try to do one video about every 1 to 2 months, just ending. We do, of course, have an April Fool's video up that you'll see for the Transformers. It's just there for fun. I mean, some people post and they're like, "What the hell is this?" and gave us thumbs down. I get it, but we were doing it for fun. We'll do the occasional fun video like that as well. But yeah, no, that's the pitch for Forgotten Battles. So check us out. Watch any of the videos you want to. I think we do some good stuff over there. And subscribe, like, share, all that fun stuff. And at this point, Derek's not here yet, but he does want to hear me talk about Thomas Gage, so I'm going to wait for him on that one. But I do think it might be worth talking a bit about British tactics. Anyway, British tactics during the war, because the American Revolution is really where you see the British moving away from firepower and towards bayonet charges. So, for instance, in the War of the Spanish Succession, the British really emphasized something called platoon fire, and this gave them the ability to win firefights. But by the War of the Austrian Succession, the weaknesses in that tactic were starting to show themselves, especially if you're fighting an army like the Highlanders or a well-led French army, which emphasized the bayonet. So by the time you get to the 7 Years' War, there starts to be a move away from platoon fire and towards bayonet tactics. James Wolfe is actually one of the proponents of this. So in the American Revolution, you get the pattern the British Army is going to tactically follow into the Napoleonic Wars, which is give the enemy a few volleys, then charge the bayonet. Oh, back, Derek? All right. I talked about forgotten battles for a bit, and I mentioned a little bit about tactics as a bit of a filler there. How this war is when the British started to rely on the bayonet, because before the American Revolution, the British in this era were mostly known for prolonged firefights, not for bayonet tactics. Yeah, for the Brits at least, Although there had been some movement towards bayonet charges with James Wolfe. In fact, he's probably the one who popularized it. But yeah, and he died as well as Montcalm. One of the few battles in history where both army commanders died. Is there a famous ancient battle where that happened? Yeah, I was gonna say maybe the Battle of Clontarf, one fought in Ireland with Brian Boru, but according to Wikipedia here, the Viking commander lived, although it looks like all of his main subordinates died. Yeah, that's what the legends say. I think one of them they have him praying before he dies, because of course this is the age of Christianity, so you got to be praying, Uh, oh God. Why, one of the Forgotten Battles episodes you read up on was the Megalopolis battle with the Spartans, and props to the Spartan king on that one. Sounds like he died going down. One quick question: have you done a video on Sertorius yet? Yeah, I'd really like to hear that one. But want to get into Mr. Thomas Gage? Yeah. I'm gonna go into spoiler alert here. This guy's dumb. And he's bad, and he deserves it too. Now, I will say one thing in defense of Gage. He did early on see the value of light infantry tactics and did some work with it. And he did go out of his way to really try to integrate loyalists into British society. And part of that's because he had married an American woman. But that said, Gage's career, he fought at Fontenoy and Culloden during the War of the Austrian Succession. He was with Edward Braddock when he was defeated. Comically enough, when the battle was over, He actually asked if he could be given a promotion because other officers had died, and it was considered very poor form. Anyway, Gage was named Commander in Chief of North America, and he held that post all the way until the American Revolution starts. Noted for excessive nepotism. He's fairly popular in the New York City social scene, although Gage found Americans repulsive. But here's what's amazing about Gage. He had this ability to hide how repulsed he was by Americans. So Americans always thought, Gage likes us and he's kind of a soft guy. Meanwhile, he's talking ill of the Americans. And here's what really gets interesting. In 1774, he becomes the governor of Massachusetts. And to the Americans, he appears soft enough to where they think they can defy him. Meanwhile, to the British government, he's telling them, I need more troops and we need more repressive measures. I believe the quote he said to George III is, they will be lambs if we are lions. Exactly. Yeah. Gage was afraid that he was going to lose his command, so he sent those troops to seize arms at Concord. Risky idea, harebrained scheme, leads to a rebellion breaking out. Once a rebellion breaks out, Gage fails to do enough to make sure the rebellion doesn't spread. He kind of stays in Boston. At any rate, Howe is sent over. It's kind of understood Howe's probably going to take over, but Gage is the commander at Bunker Hill. He's the guy who authorized the attacks, but of course doesn't go over to Bunker Hill, so he doesn't actually oversee the fighting itself. After briefly being commander-in-chief of North America, he's then replaced with Howe. And a lot of that had to do with Bunker Hill. The news of that was treated with horror in Britain. By the way, when he went to Britain after leaving America, he became really happy and essentially wrote some of the officers and was essentially the equivalent of him sticking his tongue out at them like, nah, 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 I get to be in Britain with my wife while you're out in the colonies fighting a war you can't win. Now, that's not literally what he said, but his letters, like to guys like Henry Clinton, were just essentially like, he's like, I don't envy your position at all. This is great that I'm back in Britain. He's loving it, Yeah, did a great job trying to integrate loyalists into British society. Gage was a good administrator. He had some skill at civilian military matters, except when the things really got tough in 1774. He wasn't a coward, but I'd say he had just about no military abilities outside of that. Um, he feared a war in America, and he predicted that it would be a hard slog. He never acted on his own strategic analysis. He supported coercion, but he was not ardent in the policy, so the Americans saw him as weak. I think he's a total disaster. In terms of administration, if you will, like we were talking about, like, why does a revolution happen? Why does a rebellion happen? It's because of guys like Gage. Because if you really look at it, a man like Gage is just harsh enough to piss you off, but not harsh enough to scare you. And to be fair, he never had enough men to enforce his will in all the colonies. I think there really was a misconception that if they really stuck it to Boston, that they'd be fine. And they didn't really see that even though the colonies were not well united, they were becoming more united. They had a Continental Congress. They were discussing, so I got to give Gage an F. Yeah. Yeah, they do that in Liberty or Death. They give these guys Hitler stashes, and I'm wondering if it's like a holdover from Operation Europe. You know what I mean? Because they have some. By the way, if we ever do a German generals list, we are using the Operation Europe. It's okay. But anyway, so who's our boy here again? Haldimand. Yeah. Um, well, he was actually of Swiss descent. He had a lot of experience with the 7 Years' War, fought with Geoffrey Amherst. Considered a very good administrator. He was oftentimes in North America, and he briefly served as commander-in-chief for a while Gage was in England, for instance. Interestingly enough, he refused to send troops to protect tea shipments after the Boston Tea Party. Now, one can say that he was trying to avoid, he was trying to avoid bloodshed and war, but I would say this was a mistake. By doing that, British appeared weak instead of strong. So I think that was a mistake not to have British soldiers trying to protect the tea shipments, but that's my take on it. At any rate, he's actually at Boston when the war starts, and he's the highest ranking officer around, but he was informed that because he was a foreigner, it seemed inappropriate for him to exercise command in an internal civil conflict. And I think that was more or less an excuse by the British authorities to remove him, because he was seen as kind of Gage's guy. So he was out of the picture until 1778 when he was sent to Canada. Now, by this time, the Canadian theater becomes a real backwater. The British had lost most of their Canadian force under Burgoyne. They didn't reinforce the area. In fact, they took some of the troops out. That's, by the way, also why Washington, for a time, considered an invasion of Canada with Lafayette leading the army. That nothing happened with that is debatable about that. But anyway, his command over Canada was very effective. What he would do is he would have the natives raid. He would support them with supplies and whatever troops he could spare. Other raids into the Northern Territories were held, and here was where the fun part comes. You see, Vermont at this time didn't exist. It was something called the Hampshire Grants, an area disputed between New Hampshire and New York. Well, they wanted to be their own state, their own entity. The New York and New Hampshire didn't want that. So then the leaders of Vermont, such as Ethan Allen, started negotiating with the British to have Vermont leave America and join Canada. And once they did that, the plan was most likely that Vermont would join Canada. Haldimand would send whatever British soldiers he could spare, and then along with whatever Vermont men they could spare, they would then raid and pretty much ravage northern New York. The only reason this didn't happen was because of Yorktown. Now, Ethan Allen afterwards said, I was playing them against each other. No. I think Vermont was serious. I think they were seriously considering joining with Canada and essentially declaring war against us. And Ethan Allen, for one thing, had been mistreated by George Washington, so he felt insulted by the American leadership. Well, you know. Yes. No, he is a traitor. In active negotiations, I mean, he's a traitor to the American cause, or you could say that he's finally seen the light and he's returning to the crown. Yeah. Yeah, well, he's not really going to. I mean, don't get me wrong. Ethan Allen's very entertaining, fascinating guy, but his only real claim to fame is he took Fort Ticonderoga by surprise, keeping in mind there were like 90 men there and he had a lot more troops. And, when he led an invasion force in Canada, he lost a battle and was captured, and that was it. That's Ethan Allen for you. Didn't really do much during the Revolution, and we're definitely trying to join with the British at 1781. Remember, at this point, even though we're doing well in the South, North, the economy is in ruins. Morale is very, very low. And Washington, in his letters, writes several times, we need to capture and arrest Ethan Allen. Whatever happens. So anyway, it's kind of hard to rate him. He didn't really engage in any battles during the American Revolution, but he managed Canada, which was a backwater, pretty effectively. And a lot of people held him in high regard as an officer. I think I have to at least give him a C. Yeah, I honestly think if there's no Yorktown, Vermont rejoins Canada. I don't think so, but I definitely know of one or two A's. Yes, Barry St. Ledger. Kind of happy that he's the next guy up here because he played a big role in Haldimand's raids into northern New York and in the negotiations with Ethan Allen. But anyway, he was sent to America during the relief column for Quebec. So he helped kick the Americans out of Canada. He was given a mixed force of British regulars, Hessians, Canadians, some loyalists, and their whole thing was to take Fort Stanwix in support of Burgoyne's operations. Even though his forces managed to win the Battle of Oriskany, that's definitely a Pyrrhic victory because the losses were so heavy, a lot of the natives left. And then Fort Stanwix siege was relieved. So his big operation was in the end a failure. Anyway, he stayed in Canada, tried to oversee the negotiations with Ethan Allen, and that's pretty much about it for his career. His main claim to fame was leading that mixed force on Fort Stanwix that failed. He's really a hard man to understand. There's not a lot of records about that. Not a lot of records I've run into about his personality. As far as command goes, for Fort Stanwix, he had a tough assignment. He wasn't given a lot of men, and the Americans sent 2 relief columns, one of which he fought at Oriskany, of course, and then the other one was led by Benedict Arnold, who essentially won through a ruse. So a lot of his soldiers even abandoned him. It might be telling that he was never called on to be sent anywhere else. So I think he might have been evaluated not too highly. And it should be kept in mind, though, that he was a favorite of James Wolfe. He had a good 7 years war record. I don't know. I almost hate to rate him, but I guess I go with a D. But I kind of hate to rate him. I just don't know much about the guy. Be like, you mistreated me. Charles O'Hara, one of my faves in the British Army at this time. Illegitimate son of General James O'Hara and a Portuguese mistress. So his family did have money. He did climb up the ranks fairly fast. In fact, he was a major by age 16. Imagine that, huh? Yeah, exactly. One of my favorite things about him was before going to America, he was sent to Senegal in Africa, where he commanded convict soldiers. Now, understand, of all the postings in the British Empire, this is the worst. Some years, the Senegal garrison suffered an 80% death rate from disease. This, by the way, ladies and gentlemen, is why imperialism didn't come to Africa, the African interior, in the 1700s. Because the Europeans didn't have immunity to those diseases, particularly the malaria and whatnot, and they would just die like fish in a bucket. It wouldn't be until they got quinine later on that they were able to get into the interior. That led to the scramble for Africa, of course. You can, which is funny. In South Africa, in this place in Africa, they drink lots of tonic water. And that's actually why, I don't like tonic water in America. It kind of tastes gross, but I was in South Africa a few years back, and tonic water tastes good over there because, hey, it's like common. It's a common drink, Oh no, I put gin in it too, but seriously, gin and tonic doesn't taste that great to me. Well, of course, it's better than vodka tonic. I'll say that. Yeah, I'm not big on tequila. I'm with you on that. But anyway, so hmm. Yeah, you're a madman. Okay. O'Hara was fiery, aggressive. He was kind of a hard taskmaster, but the men generally liked him from what I can tell. Um, O'Hara hated Clinton, so him and Cornwallis got along. And O'Hara was essentially Cornwallis's second in command for much of the Southern campaign. Oh, remember I told you when Cornwallis had the cannons fire into his own men? It was O'Hara who was essentially wounded, was begging him not to do it while they're fighting. And keep in mind, when I'm talking about they're fighting at Guilford Courthouse, the American and British soldiers actually clubbing each other with muskets. It's a rare thing because bayonet wounds and wounds from being clubbed were rare in musket combat, with one exception: if you assaulted a prepared position. So an assault on a fortified position, you could really get genuine hand-to-hand combat. But in an open field, it almost never happened. Something like that. You should always keep in mind that they were fighting in a wooded area as well, so that can kind of add to that. In an actual straight-up open field, you almost never hear an account of anybody getting bayoneted or anything, right? But for a prepared position, especially if you're assaulting the city, not uncommon. But that said, this is one of those cases. So he was the man who had to surrender at Yorktown because Cornwallis being a bitch. Yeah. Fun fact, Charles O'Hara after the war was in pretty bad health. He actually fled to Italy because of some really severe gambling debts. What is it with these guys, man? They're always getting gambling debts, Yeah, well, here's a fun fact. He is the British Army commander at Toulon during the French Revolution. Yep. He is the one. He was Napoleon captured him. No, I thought about it. He could be, but I thought I'd talk about him here. He's mostly known for his stuff in the American Revolution. By the way, they O'Hara did not meet with Napoleon when he was captured and when the whole thing happened. He was pissed off. Well, it gets even funnier. Guess who he was exchanged for? Rochambeau, the French commander at Yorktown. Yeah. And remember, O'Hara actually offered his sword not to George Washington, but to Rochambeau, who then pointed at George Washington. Then George Washington said, well, you're the second in command, so you give it to my second in command, Benjamin Lincoln. Yep. Um, O'Hare, very, very high ranking, very high ranking. I kind of see like O'Hara as being involved in this web of coincidence and just kind of unlucky, even though he's very good. Everybody's talked about how he was just a very effective combat commander. That said, he's one of the only guys on this list who never led troops independently in a battle. Mostly included him here because he's got some fun stories and he was like very much involved in the latter half of the war. Bit of a hard one to rate, but I'd have to go with a B on O'Hara. Yeah, I do have to. So I will say one fun fact about O'Hara. He oh, give me a sec here. Yeah. He was threatened with the guillotine. Apparently befriended Thomas Paine because they were both imprisoned by the Jacobins. Oh, that's it. The thing about Yorktown, the French, of course, let Washington get the well, not Washington in this case, Benjamin Lincoln get the sword because it was a politeness thing. They're in America, right? But I mean, it really Yorktown's a French victory more. I mean, they provide the engineers. They provided at least half the troops, and more importantly, they provide the ships that made sure Cornwallis couldn't escape. You know? So O'Hara was correct to try to give his sword to the French. But anyway, who's our next fellow? Oh, James Grant. James Grant's a fucking hoot, man. He has one of my favorite quotations ever uttered by a British officer. He does, man. He was came from a Scottish family, fought in a variety of battles. By the way, he really hated Americans. He was involved in the campaign to take Fort Duquesne, which is today Pittsburgh. He thought the militia were awful. This is also he met George Washington during this time, had a low opinion of him, and he just did not like the Americans. This can't be made clear enough. Which is why when the revolution started, he declared that if he had 1,000 men, he could go from one end of America to the other and geld all of the males. So Grant literally said, I can castrate every American with 1,000 British soldiers. He might be, but this is the thing about the British. They were very shocked by Bunker Hill. Gage had a great quote about Bunker Hill. He said, "Wow, in fighting us, the Americans showed more pluck than they ever did fighting the French." Exactly. And to be fair, militia performance was not good, right? So, correct. Yeah, exactly. I mean, the the British just immediately thought, oh, they're incompetent. And one of the problems with Bunker Hill's one of the negative effects Bunker Hill has on the Americans, positive effect has on the British, is that for the British, they do start to take the Americans more seriously, of course. For the Americans, it created a confidence that the British could be defeated in similar ways. But actually, we'll talk about more with that with the American list. So anyway, Grant was actually a very good tactical planner, and he was kind of William Howe's tactical assistant, if you will. Like he would plan the flank attacks that Howe did. But Grant was never the one given responsibility for the actual flank attacks. He was always the one who led the diversionary attack. Now, after Monmouth, Clinton essentially saw Grant and knew Grant was one of Howe's guys, so he sent him to the Caribbean, where he captured St. Lucia, which is a very important victory because, generally speaking, the British didn't do very well in the Caribbean during this war. This is one of their few victories. Grant's an interesting guy. He was a very good tactician, pretty solid officer. He did well in the one independent command that he was given. I think it's telling that he was the guy who planned a lot of William Howe's actions. I really got to go with B with Grant. Even if his rhetoric probably, made more Americans join the cause than the British would have liked, I want to keep my testicles. Yes, indeed. Who knew they wanted to keep their testicles, right? Yeah. Nickname is one of my favorites in the whole war. No Flint Gray. As no, quite the opposite. He arrived in America after the New York campaign, so he's brought along to Philadelphia. And him and his staff officer, John Andre, who later on got executed, because essentially John Andre was executed because Benedict Arnold escaped. But anyway, they surprised an American force at Palloy Tavern. And Gray had his men put no flint in their muskets because he was afraid if one of them accidentally shot, the Americans would know they were there. So they're trying to get surprise. Palloy Tavern, the British lost 10 men and we lost 200. Essentially, the British just came with bayonets and let the rest let it do their work. The Americans called it a massacre. No doubt there are probably some people who tried to surrender who were killed, but it wasn't a massacre. It was just a surprise attack that turned to a disaster for the Americans. Gray did well at Monmouth. He also won another small battle at Tappan, New Jersey, using similar tactics to Palloy Tavern. He served in second command to Henry Clinton and was kind of Clinton's advisor and right-hand man. And of course, he led numerous raids, like Martha's Vineyard and a few other places. He's one of the few officers who seem to have gotten along with Clinton. And to be fair, they were both very able tacticians. Yeah, he was appointed commander-in-chief for the British Army before peace. I think what happened is that they replaced Henry Clinton with Charles Gray, and then they settled on a peace treaty. So Gray was never actually able to take his position there. Yeah, Carleton's the one who oversaw the evacuation. Yeah, I don't even think he actually took command, to be honest. Anyway, he did take part in the French Revolutionary Wars in the Caribbean. Yeah, one of the few British officers who, after the revolution's over, his reputation was enhanced. And I got to give him a B. I mean, he seems to have been a very good officer. Rarely run into anybody who has a negative thing about his generalship. It is, man. It is pretty cool, huh? I'm gonna be cool. Yeah. And now comes. Oh God. Yeah, maybe. Um, I don't claim to be an expert on them. I think it's very important to have them on a list like this. So Dunmore was appointed to governor of Virginia. He can be pretty gruff. At first, they didn't like him. In fact, he dissolved the House of Burgesses in 1774. But he launched Dunmore's War, like you mentioned, which which was to secure the Ohio River Valley for Virginia and for Western settlement, and that was the big victory at Point Pleasant. Now, there were rumors, especially after Point Pleasant, that Dunmore's War was just a diversion by Dunmore. You could see the American Revolution happening. And while your average royal governor was kind of fleeing the mob, Dunmore tried to fight him. So what he did was he raised some loyalist militia. He got some natives to join up with him. And what's interesting is that he issued what's called Lord Dunmore's Offer of Emancipation. This is the first emancipation proclamation in American history. The units were formed in what's called the Ethiopian Regiment. And keep this in mind, this is totally an act of desperation. I mean, Dunmore, to my knowledge, owned slaves. He definitely had no problems with the slave trade. But his army was ravaged by smallpox. His best officer was Charles Fordyce, who was killed, and Dunmore fled Virginia. Somebody told me they were in Norfolk said where he actually fled, there's a marker to tell you where he fled because he became such a villain in Virginia. George Washington at one point called him one of the most dangerous opponents that the Americans were facing because of his Emancipation Proclamation. Also, his estate in his estate in Scotland has pineapples. How about that? Yeah, it was a thing. He liked pineapples, I guess. Apparently I've read somewhere the Ethiopian Regiment. I don't know what happened to the Ethiopian Regiment afterwards. Anyway, Dunmore Street in Norfolk is where you can see the plaque. I think one of the problems is that Dunmore is waging this war in Virginia, and Gage and Howe essentially do nothing to help him. Nothing to help the Loyalist uprisings in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And I think that really is a major failure by both men, is that they're so fixated on Boston while guys like Dunmore and Governor Wright in Georgia are fighting for their lives. You read about him recently. What do you think of Dunmore? Yeah. He really was. He really could be a hard guy to work with, you know? Yeah, one could say that while he's probably going to get kicked out of Virginia anyway, his actions probably did a lot to whip up support for the rebels in the South. Hard to rate. I think I go with an E. What do you think? And it's interesting you mention that because, I mean, Cornwallis, he could get loyalist support in the Carolinas and Georgia. So he decided to invade Virginia where there are no loyalists, or very few, you know? Should be noted, though, that I think one of the things that might have encouraged Cornwallis to go to Virginia was the British incursion that was happening there before he got there. It was pretty successful. Famously, they made Thomas Jefferson flee from the governor's mansion. Yes, something like that. Yeah, something like that. Yeah, I guess because of the anti-slavery, they'd be like, well, he freed slaves. I'm like, yeah, only for military service, you know? Honestly, we're going to talk a bit more about emancipation a little later on, Carleton. But I mean, look, One person said it best if you're thinking about the American Civil War. If anything, the fact that the North delayed emancipating their slaves was unusual. The idea of freeing your opponent's slaves to fight for you is as old as what, like the Bronze Age? Yeah, it's pretty. I'm not giving Dunmore any genius or humanitarian points here for that. Yeah, exactly. Uh, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Oh, the piece. Really quick question: the piece in Nicias, was it just a truce, or could it have been something more lasting? Mm. And now we get to the most controversial commander on this list, and I believe one of the most controversial commanders in all of military history, William Howe. And then there's his brother George Howe. You know about him? No, no, Richard's the brother. George Howe died during the 7 Years' War. Yeah, George Howe was a light infantry guy, and he was so popular with the colonial forces, they actually put up a statue to him in Massachusetts. Yeah, so the Howe trio were very important military figures of this time. William Howe left the 7 Years' War with a very high reputation. This can't be emphasized. Essentially, everybody, when that war is over, like, he is the rising star of Britain. So let's say Britain had fought a big war with the French in 1775. William Howe would have been their commander. Um, yeah. So, what can you tell us a bit about Mr. Howe? I'm gonna go run and grab some more water again. I'm a bit thirsty today, and we're talking a lot. But yeah, tell me something what you think about William Howe. Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. I think the only thing that was off was Monmouth. He was gone by then. Yeah, in fact, they dragged him in front of a commission to explain why he had failed because in their mind, they're like, "Wait, we sent our best, and he didn't do it." You know, 78, 78, but early 78. Yeah, so Howe eventually he led the attack at Breed's Hill. Psychological impact on that can't be understated. I mean, can't be overstated. He apparently said that at Breed's Hill, when he saw the British regulars getting mowed down, he saw the horrific officer losses. He literally wrote, "At that moment, I had a feeling." He wrote something like, "At that moment, I had a feeling I had never felt in my life." Because consider he had known nothing but success, right? His once optimistic and enterprising nature then gave way to essentially lethargy and to staying behind in engagements. That's important, by the way. Howe was known for being a frontline officer, and he's pretty popular with the men. Although there's one interesting thing that happened at Bunker Hill. They had some British deserters who, right before the attack, were brought in front of Howe. There was like 3 of them. And Howe said, "Normally we just hang you all, but I need men, so we're only going to hang one of you." So when they went up Breed's Hill, they literally saw a hanged British soldier before those men. And I saw this. If you go to Breed's Hill, to the national park thing, they have a big monument there and everything. But what's really cool is they have a diorama of the battle that is superb. They actually have a miniature of the guy hanging. Yeah, I was like, wow, it's the best miniature work I've ever seen. Excellent. So anyway, Howe then had to abandon Boston in a very embarrassing fashion. Washington seized the Dorchester Heights and put cannons up there. But then Howe was given command of the largest army that's at that point ever been sent by the British to North America. We're talking like 30,000. And he takes New York City. Now, one could say that he didn't vigorously pursue Washington, such as at Long Island. They're like, hey, he forced Washington out, and then he didn't attack him. The reason he didn't attack Washington, and I say allowed him to escape, he would have rather he not, but the reason he didn't was because of losses. See, Howe understood that his soldiers would not be easily replaced. There was a lot of strain in Britain just to put together the force they did send. So if you really look at what Howe tells them, he doesn't say like, "Oh, I didn't want to attack Washington." He says, if I attacked Washington, his back was against the wall, in an entrenched position, the losses would have been heavy. So a lot of what he's doing is to avoid that. Look at the Battle of Brandywine. He outflanks Washington. And there's an argument made that when he outflanked Washington, he wasn't attacking Washington like that because he wanted Washington to fight. There's actually a military historian who said that Washington, instead of saying, "Oh, my flank's turned, I can't win this," said, "Let's fight it out." Right? And, of course, Washington loses Brandywine. Now, it's not like a sweeping British victory, but it's they inflicted much heavier losses on us than we did. And, of course, there was a wave of desertion afterwards. I remember one historian said that maybe Washington was too dumb to know to retreat at Brandywine. I wouldn't go that far, but I understand the point. Howe did very well at Germantown. That might be one of his best moments. You see, Germantown's kind of like Shiloh in a way. British Army gets surprised, but they recover fast enough. They get some reinforcements. They launch a series of counterattacks that eventually drive him back. Howe did very well in that battle. That's where he really did go up to the front lines and help rally the men and keep them going. That said, Howe was supposed to go to Albany, and he didn't. He decided, I'm going to go take Philadelphia. I'll take the capital. I'll take the biggest city in America. And that meant that Burgoyne didn't have the support that he needed. So there are many people who think that Burgoyne lost because of Howe. Now, I wouldn't go that far. Burgoyne made some very crucial mistakes. That said, officers loved Howe. Soldiers loved him. So when he left, he was given a grand party in Philadelphia, which was called like Messiana or something. Siana, I can't pronounce it. I'll spell it for you, though. Mischianza. Yeah. By the way, after returning to America, because he had taken part in the war, his constituents voted him out of Parliament. See, he had repeatedly told people in Parliament, "I don't support the war in America. I don't support the course of actions in America. I won't go there." And then, of course, he did to win glory. Yeah. That said, he to be active in the military. Was considered for command of the British Army in Flanders in 1793. Instead, he commanded troops in Britain until 1803. I don't know how. It's very hard to understand how, because a lot of people say that, oh, Howe was trying to fight. Howe didn't want to engage in bloody combat because he wanted to pacify the Americans. I think there's some truth in that. He didn't want to fight a hard war. He was not enthusiastic about recruiting loyalists. That much is for sure. Some of the more talented subordinates, such as Percy and Clinton, were marginalized by Howe. So what he was trying to do was a war of leniency, where he'd win battles and seize cities, and he would at the same time preserve his force. That strategy failed. You could make a case that it failed because he did not support Burgoyne in Albany. Now, that point's debatable. Howe goes to Albany, then George Washington will be there, and the Highlands, those Highlands, the Hudson would be a tough nut to crack. So maybe Howe, in a way, was smart to go to Philadelphia. But you could also make the case that he brought too many men with him to Philadelphia, that it wasn't an effective enough diversion, that he'd left Clinton with too few troops. But that goes back to the fact that the British in North America arguably don't have enough men. They can control major ports, but they have a hard time in controlling the interior. And why can't they control the interior? Well, they're not recruiting loyalists. That's one reason. And one reason for not doing that is because of Howe. So Howe had a strategy. It didn't work. I don't know the degree to which he could have been more aggressive and pulled things off. I say that because a lot of people say that don't take into consideration that the Americans had a strong position at White Plains and at Long Island, at least when they retrieved their entrenchments. I think Howe at his worst, though, was New Jersey. He kind of just sent enough men to occupy the place and chase Washington. Then they were set up in winter quarters and Washington attacked. But it wasn't just that. Howe then tried to catch Washington in New Jersey after that. The whole series of campaigns and little skirmishes fought in New Jersey, early part of 1777, and nothing ever happens. Washington just escapes him constantly. Washington, at that point, had accepted a Fabian strategy, named after, of course, Fabius Maximus. And this is actually why Howe and Cornwallis started to call Washington the Fox. Now, some American historians heard that, years later and went like, oh, the Fox. That meant they thought Washington was crafty. I'm like, sorta. What it really is that guys like Howe and Cornwallis go fox hunting. And so Washington's the prey. But Washington could escape any of those maneuvers, so he wasted his time in New Jersey. I think Howe's heart wasn't in it. I think he was a talented tactician. I think he did have a strategic vision, but in order for it to work, he needed to destroy Washington's army or capture it or seize Philadelphia in 1776 or something. And you just get that feeling that Howe could also be by turns lazy. By this time, he was really enjoying drinking and fornicating. Yeah, he wasn't the biggest womanizer in the British Army, but he liked his mistresses. I will say he's in a strategic paradox, trying to be lenient and preserve his army and convince the Americans to give it up. I believe he didn't understand the scope of the conflict that he was fighting. Henry Clinton had a better grasp on it. And Henry Clinton's grasp is much more brutal. Yeah, recruit loyalists, make it a civil war, burn coastal towns, raid the countryside. And Clinton's strategy was working. The American economy was breaking down, support was waning. Howe's strategy just didn't work. I got to go. He kind of just said he was court of inquiry. He essentially laid out why he was doing what he was doing. But I think he kind of wanted to try to avoid the whole issue afterwards. You know what I mean? Like, can we not talk about what happened in America? I got to go with the D. Yeah. He did do pretty well tactically, I must say, and the seizure of New York was a big blow to the Americans. That can't be ignored. Monmouth, debatably. There's a whole lot of scholarship that says Charles Lee did not screw up at Monmouth. I mean, yeah, because that the problem with Monmouth was that Washington's attack plan was poor, and it was. Essentially, you have the entire American army going down one road to try to catch the British as they're retreating. Charles Lee caught the British rear guard, but when they turned around and attacked him, they outnumbered him, and he wasn't properly supported. So Lee fell back. And some people say that Washington used Monmouth as an excuse to get rid of Lee. Now, I'm not saying that Lee brilliantly handled it, but to be fair, the plan was faulty. And we'll talk about George when we get there, but one of Washington's weaknesses is that his tactical plans were oftentimes bad. There's no other way to put it. Yeah, kind of a bad tactic. But well, I mean, I say bad. I guess erratic is a better way to put it, because there's some battles where he'd be tactically pretty good, and the other ones you'd be like, "What the hell are you thinking?" Yeah. Monmouth's one of them. It's a bad plan. I have to say, of the Liberty or Death ratings, Washington's is one of the most dead on. Yeah. Yeah, there was other high-ranking Hessians. I did consider putting Johann Rahl here, the one who was at Trenton. Yeah, although to be fair, he played a leading role in the capture of Fort Washington, where he very famously, like with his bare hands, was moving the barricades out of the way. His men loved him. Also you could talk about like why was he surprised at Trenton, like why things go down the way they did. Generally, though, like I said, your Hessians were not given too many independent commands. They might lead a detachment, like Friedrich Baum at Bennington. There was Karl von Dunop, who was sent to take a fort after the capture of Philadelphia. He failed at that one. But Knyphausen was different. The British were impressed with Knyphausen. Now, the guy before Knyphausen was Leopold von Heister, who was an older man, and him and Howe hated each other. So Knyphausen was kind of undermined Heister and ingratiated himself with Howe. Oh, I misspoke. It was Knyphausen who was moving barricades out of his way at Fort Washington. So he helped lead that attack. And Knyphausen was given command of the main Hessian forces. That said, Howe had a very high opinion of Knyphausen, so he was part of all strategic, operational, and tactical decision making. And understand that's rare for the Hessians. Usually the Hessians were the kind of guys that just said, "Here's your orders, go follow them. Go follow them." You know what I mean? Knyphausen did very well at Brandywine. Fun thing, he really liked being in Philadelphia. He had no problem pillaging rebel property, but he didn't extend that to his men. And Clinton also trusted Knyphausen generally, and he left him in command of New York City when he conducted the siege of Charleston. Knyphausen did lead an attack into New Jersey, but lost at a small battle called Springfield. This was his only independent command. He didn't do so great. But it should be known by that time he was getting pretty sick and apparently was blind in one eye as well. Yeah, so anyway, he left in 1782 and left the Hessians to Lossburg. And that's pretty much about it. He was a pretty competent and solid soldier. Most men gave him high marks. The men generally liked him. In a place where nobles were known for being pompous, Knyphausen was considered more approachable and down to earth. That said, not too much of a genius, and his one operation in New Jersey didn't go too well. I think I'd go with a C. Yeah. Oh man, this guy sucks. Oh no, no, but yeah, I mean that's rare, right? I mean, well, Ledley was a coward. Leslie was not. Leslie owned Leslie owned his stuff to status, wealth. Came from a powerful Scottish family. This, by the way, he was very. Let me say he was very good at winning others over. Um, he was known for like how could I say like um, having like food and wine at his thing. Is very good at winning others over. So you just that I mean, think about it. You have a high-ranking noble who's pretty sociable. He's popular with the other officers. So anyway, he was at Castle William until the evacuation of Boston. And at White Plains, he's the one who led the attack that failed. And he bungled at Princeton. However, Clinton seemed to like him. He served with him at Charleston, and he led one of the big raids into Virginia. Leslie was then sent to Cornwallis. Now, this is interesting. Cornwallis had two options at this point. He could have stayed with James Webster. James Webster was one of his regiment commanders. Webster was the man who broke the rebel flank at Camden. By all accounts, Webster is a fantastic combat officer. But I mean, Leslie's brave, but more importantly, he's a high-ranking noble and he's sociable. So Cornwallis gave Leslie the main attack command at Guilford, which he completely bungles. And by the way, Webster gets killed in that. Anyway, after Cornwallis surrendered, he was commander of the Southern Theater. After the war, he returned to Scotland and he died in Glasgow when he was hit in the head with a rock during a riot. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, there's not much good to say about Leslie. He was kind of an indifferent officer, right? And then he gets this I don't know, the inglorious. I know he was brave and everything, but that inglorious end makes sense, though, doesn't it? He's not really that impressive, is he? Yeah. Um. Yeah, I don't know. I have a really low opinion of him. I think he's an F. Yeah, outside of his bravery, not much else to him. Yeah, I think woefully inadequate pretty much sums up Alexander Leslie. Hmm. William Phillips, fascinating guy. Your artillery at this time tend to be filled more with like middle class types, with like real low nobility. Phillips, though, loved the artillery, so that's what he joined up in. By the end of the 7 Years' War, he's recognized one of the best cannon commanders in the British Army. Um, so anyway, he was sent to Quebec in 1776 to help out Carleton. Kind of serves as kind of like helps out with leads the artillery and help build the fleet that they tried to use at Lake Champlain, or that they did use at Lake Champlain. Anyway, Phillips was the second in command of Burgoyne during the push on New York. So on the one hand, he's Burgoyne's second in command and chief advisor. At the same time, he leads the engineers and artillery. His finest moment came at Fort Ticonderoga when he convinced Burgoyne to place guns on Sugarloaf Mountain. The line was, "Where a goat can go, a man can go. Where a man can go, he can drag a gun." The artillery placed there forced the Americans to evacuate in a huff. Um, That said, he's with the army when they surrender. Fun fact, he went to Virginia, hung out with Thomas Jefferson. Now, that's why he's a prisoner. So he would dine with Jefferson. Jefferson described Phillips as like the most British man in the British Empire. They actually would debate each other, but they were very intelligent. And one thing they kind of shared was that I think one thing is that both men recognized is that they're very committed to the cause of their country. I believe that they eventually had a mutual respect for each other in that sense. They believed the other one was not simply some profiteer or something, but actually had ideals. Anyway, Phillips was exchanged for Benjamin Lincoln, and he led the initial attack on Virginia in 1781. Won a small battle at Blandford, what is today Petersburg. So there's a Battle of Petersburg in the American Revolution. But then got typhoid fever and died. Eventually, his troops were led by Benedict Arnold and then Cornwallis, who then they surrendered at Yorktown. Phillips was excellent. Almost everybody had good things to say about him. He was aggressive, imaginative. He rarely gave bad advice. Probably one of the only piece of bad advice he gave was he approved the Bennington scheme, which ended in disaster. I got to go with the B for Phillips. Yeah, Lord Francis here. Very interesting guy. He was like besties with Banastre Tarleton. And essentially they went to Oxford together, and what do you think they did in Oxford? Yeah, drinking, fornicating, and gambling, right? Yeah. I mean, gambling's probably Burgoyne's worst vice. Fornicating's probably Henry Clinton's. I want to say Rawdon's was probably fornicating as well, but who knows? I mean, I don't know the guy, right? He was seen as a bit silly by his fellow officers, a bit of a fop, if you will. But he did very well at Breed's Hill. There was a rumor that he was the one who killed Joseph Warren, who was one of the American commanders at Hill. So very well thought of guy. And he served on Clinton's staff. He was a bit of a Clinton favorite. One of the things he kept a journal. One of the things his journal's famous for, it's one of the most quoted lines by any British officer, is where he jokes about British soldiers raping women on Staten Island. Sounds like great PR. I think, though, Rawdon was Rawdon's a bit of an amoral fellow, at least from what I've read. So anyway, when fought at Camden, when Cornwallis went to invade North Carolina, he left Rawdon in South Carolina. Rawdon's force is just not large enough. Now, he does win Hobkirk's Hill, but it's very much a Pyrrhic victory. He's able to relieve 96, which I know that name sounds weird, huh? 96? Exactly. But yeah, people say 96, yeah, but he wins this victory at 96. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Anyway, he served as governor of India, was in Canada, where he was very popular. He didn't really have a lot of tactical or military skill, though. He seemed to prefer frontal assaults. Although everybody said he was extremely brave and could be rather charismatic. Later in life, he became more known for his diplomacy and his politics as well. In a time of British conservatism, he was a bit more of a lefty or reformer. That said, man, notorious for his loose morals. A very fascinating man. Also, should be noted, this image they have of him, not quite what he looks like. It's one of those generic images they use. But hey, that's Francis Rawdon in the game. Yeah. I think for Francis Rawdon, I'd have to go with a D. Not a great tactician, but he showed some skill administration. He was brave, and most officers just liked him. He got along really well with others. Not a, oh yeah, I was gonna say not a small feat in this army. Yeah. Lord North was the prime minister. Close enough, man. He does look. This guy does look a lot like Francis Smith. What can I say about Francis Smith? He was obese. He was dull. He was lazy. He saw no action in any war before the American Revolution. However, he was rich. Oh, he's great, man. He was, however, very wealthy. He bought his commissions, and he was connected to the Hanoverians. He was actually friends with George III. So he gets sent to Boston, and he was, by the way, he by that time he was considered almost too fat to ride a horse. But for whatever idiotic reason, Gage gives him command of the force that goes to Concord. Smith made a bunch of mistakes. Right? I mean, the movement out was delayed. He stayed at the rear of the column, so he didn't know what was happening. So he wasn't at Lexington when things went down. The guy was there was Major Pitcairn, who famously said, "Disperse, ye damn rebels, disperse." What else happened? I mean, he could have saved the situation at Lexington. Regardless of what I can say about Smith, Smith was a fairly level-headed guy, so he might have been able to look at Lexington and be like, "Hey, let's not shoot each other." You know what I mean? But hey, he wasn't there for that. In fact, when he did get there, he ordered his men to stop shooting and attacking people. At that point, he made a crucial decision. He asked for reinforcements and then went to Concord anyway. By the time he gets to Concord, there's nothing to destroy. It's already been evacuated. And Smith's column was almost annihilated on the way back to Boston. Nevertheless, Smith was made a general. He failed to protect the Dorchester Heights, which led to the fall of Boston. He did lead some brigades in a few battles, but by that time they understood he was incompetent, so he was sent to the backwater of Rhode Island, where he was at Newport. Regardless, he managed to make the rank of lieutenant general by 1787, one of the highest ranks in the British Army. Yeah. He has no redeeming qualities as an officer. He's an F. Yeah, there's few men who were less worthy of command than Francis Smith. What? Yeah. Maybe not, man. Maybe he just would have eaten a lot of stuff, you know? uh, yeah, well, you bloody ban. What do you know about Mr. Tarleton? They called him Havington. Yeah. By the way, he led the patrol that captured Charles Lee in 1776. That's how he first earned his name. Yeah, he's like literally one of the only officers who leaves this war with an enhanced reputation. Anyway, the womanizing can't be. It's like, I mean, he's notorious for it. He almost fought a duel with a fellow officer because he slept with his wife. You know, really enjoying things. But that said, Tarleton is kind of like there's this tradition of these cavalry commanders like von Seydlitz and oh god, who was the other one? What was one of the ones in the Napoleonic Wars? These kind of cavalry commanders where LaSalle, where the man is devil may care. It's part of the persona of the cavalryman, but he is serious about his work. He makes sure that he has a very well disciplined force and a force that's capable of doing charges, reconnaissance, raids. And to be fair, when he goes south, he's not really doing as much gambling and womanizing as he did before. Although he did famously say, "I've killed more men and slept with more women than anyone else in America." Possibly true. This guy is going to sleep with a lot of women and kill a lot of men. So he's famous for overtaking Buford's column at Waxhaws. Probably the most controversial battle of the war. The Americans called it a massacre. The British simply said, "Hey, we just, eliminated your force." Regular battle. There was something of a breakdown during discipline. So I think it's a case of a thing that starts off as a battle and then starts to devolve into a massacre. That said, did excellent at Camden. Guerrilla tactics-wise, he was fighting Pickens, Sumter, Marion. Accused of atrocities, but to be fair, these guys are also committing atrocities as well. This is a very brutal type of war. He won most of his battles with these men. No, he'll be with him, and I'll get to that in a sec. As far as the rebel leader, the partisan leaders go, he had more respect for Sumter than Marion. And keep this in mind: Francis Marion was effective, but Francis Marion kind of operate over a smaller patch of land. Sumter, on the other hand, tended to have a larger group, was more active, and he had this talent for escaping. So Tarleton actually viewed Sumter as a bigger deal than Francis Marion. Not to downplay Marion, by the way. Marion was a very effective guerrilla commander. Yeah, he's the chief inspiration, of course, because Francis Marion is the one who became more famous afterward. I think some had to do with the fact that Sumter was a pretty rough fellow. Francis Marion's kind of this romantic thing, like, I'm the swamp fox, Sumter, meanwhile, is like a boxer who loses matches, but he makes sure that his opponent feels it, if you will. So, he increasingly became more bitter. I mean, you keep fighting an anti-guerrilla campaign, you're going to get more bitter, of course. Tarleton started to suffer wounds, and then came cowpens. Now, Daniel Morgan understood what kind of tactics Tarleton was going to use, so he tailor-made his tactics to destroy Tarleton's force, and he did. However, Tarleton escaped because he's such a great horseman and warrior. He wanted the few men to get out. Regardless of that, he still leads the cavalry. At Yorktown, he was on the opposite end. He was at Gloucester Point, and fought a few skirmishes where he did pretty well, but then had to surrender. Yeah, returned to Britain a celebrity. I think another reason would be political. He was associated with the Whigs and Charles James Fox. And keep in mind that as far as British conservative political power goes, this is the era when they're at their high point. So I think there's like a lot of that. There's some political stuff going too. But yeah, he was older. His health wasn't the best. Very infamous in some circles for his vocal support of slavery and opposition to the emancipation of slavery. Yeah, he's like I never seen it, but this movie Amazing Grace. Apparently, he's like one of the chief villains in the film. I haven't seen it, so I can't comment on the quality of the film. But yeah, no, Tarleton was very much a guy's like, hey, we can't end slavery. This makes us money, you know. Um, yeah, Tarleton. I mean, what can I say? It's kind of like a both attractive and repulsive all at once. You know, but he's yeah, I guess you could say misfortune, but I mean, hey, well, that's what happens. That's what happens when you drink like a fish, right? Or like, I mean, he did not live. He did not lead a healthy life. You know. Uh, yeah. Um. But yeah, no, he was. I don't know. I mean, look, he come on, he had a good life, man. You know, gambling, drinking, lots of victories, right? Yeah, dude, he even got a warship named after him. Wait. Oh no, I'm sorry. No, no, no. A, no, I'm sorry, not a warship, a slave ship. My bad. There you go, huh? I say fascinating just because he is charismatic. He's entertaining to read about. He's very daring, but he is pretty morally repulsive. He definitely carried out some war crimes. Staunch supporter of slavery. And I'm yeah, well, of course, I mean, apparently you can found hospitals in Bristol, England, but they'll strip your statue down because you may have made money on the slave trade. Um, I don't know, man. Tarleton, what do you think of him as a commander? I mean, he lost horribly at Cowpens. It's up there. Might be. Thing is that all it really was he just sees American militia and he's like, charge. And it's worked at a time, right? I mean, why stop? Definitely at Cowpens. I kind of see Cowpens impresses me a lot because it's not Daniel Morgan beating an idiot. It's Daniel Morgan beating very good commander. Um, I got to go with the B for Tarleton though. Ultimately, his battles with the guerrillas were not. He was fighting them. He was given as good as he got, but it ultimately wasn't successful. But I think that has more to do with King's Mountain. He does lose at Cowpens, so there is some questions about if he had tactical finesse. That said, the man won a number of victories and was definitely a talented cavalry commander. You can make a well, yeah, I guess some. Yeah, no, Pickens is a scrub. What am I saying? Oh, actually, I won't call Pickens a scrub because I was reading about Kettle Creek recently, a battle in Georgia, and he attacked a loyalist camp. He was outnumbered, and he actually like routed the entire camp. Pretty impressive victory. It's kind of like King's Mountain before King's Mountain. Yeah, you can make a point for that. I can't give him an A though. There's a few two weaknesses there. I give him a B. Yeah, but hey, he escaped. So in some ways, even though he loses this battle, there was definitely a lot of officers said, "Hey, look, you've won more battles than you've lost, and it's a testament to your skill that you fought your way out of there." You know. Yeah, good point to be made there. I'm not an expert on cow pens, although I've got there's a book I'm going to read about it in the next few months. I always called him Pigot, you know. You never know. He actually could be of the Huguenot descent. Yeah, yeah, it could be. Do you know? Yeah, that's right. You said you don't know anything about Mr. Pigot, do you? Yeah, he's not a super well-known one. He was one of the officers at Breed's Hill. He actually led the main cat column at Breed's Hill, the first British attempt. But he was very, very brave at that battle. And he was with the army when they captured New York. He was sent to command the troops in Rhode Island. And this is important because in 1779, but let me confirm. No, 1778. The Americans and French attempt to take Rhode Island. And it'll fail. This major effort to seize the British garrison there fails. Overall, Pigot's leadership during the siege was very good. So he's a very well regarded officer. That said, there's not a hell of a lot known about him except that he was brave and competent. Probably just got to go to sea. Archibald Campbell is one of the unsung badass of the American Revolution. He comes from a very prestigious Scottish family, the Campbells. You know, most famous for the massacre at Glencoe, or most infamous, if you will. So anyway. Yeah, there were some Campbells there. Anyway, fun fact about Campbell: he was sent over to America, and get this, he was captured in Boston Harbor in 1706. I don't know the exact details of it, but essentially he's captured, and I think I want to say he was traded out for Ethan Allen. Anyway, he gets sent over to Howe, and then he's with Clinton. Now, Clinton didn't really like Campbell, but he decided to give him. Campbell, comes from a powerful family, and he hadn't really had a chance yet. And he sends him in command of the troops that are going to take Savannah, Georgia. So he's the guy who takes Savannah, and his attack thing, it's brilliantly done. Like, he lands near the city, marches up to the American army led by Robert Howe, not related to the Howe brothers, is a different Howe. Use everybody. But anyway, he learned from a local slave there was a path to the swamp. Now, this slave is interesting to me. This slave's name was Dolly. And it was actually not a slave of an American, of a rebel, but a slave of the royal governor of Georgia. So this British slave, if you will, gives them the path to the swamp. They use that, outflank the Americans, and then the moment he hears the gunfire, he marches his men forward. Robert Howe ordered a retreat. The entire American line collapsed. Most men didn't even fire back. So the British chased them through Savannah, capture a lot of them. Many of them drowned trying to cross the nearby rivers and creeks. So this is one of the biggest British victories. He's taken Savannah. He then marched into the interior of Georgia. He was told that he had to report to Britain. Here's a fun one for you. Before he's going to leave, though, talks to his replacement commander, and he says, "Hey, I know I'm leaving, but I found out the American camp at Briar Creek isn't well guarded. Here's my plan to attack it. just gave him the details and the plan. That officer then launched the attack at Briar Creek, which is another sweeping British victory where the Americans are outflanked and routed from the. So Campbell takes Savannah. He helps secure the Georgia interior. And even though he didn't lead it, he planned one of Britain's most lopsided battles, or lopsided victories, if you will. So, superb commander, very, very aggressive. All of his letters, he talks about how he can't wait to get at the Americans. Really didn't like the Americans. I got to give him an A. Just, I know he wasn't involved in the war for a super long amount of time, but everything I've read about him recently in those campaigns indicates to me that he was a fantastic officer. Yeah, unfortunately. Yeah, a funny thing, like his image for Liberty or Death doesn't look like him. It's one of those generic images. And in that game, he's like a mediocre loyalist commander. I'm like, wait, he's part of one of the most powerful families in Scotland. I don't know. Liberty or Death, man. The game surprises you with its accuracy and then shocks you with its inaccuracy. Yeah. Oh, Prevost. That's our last officer. Yeah. Augustine Prevost is odd fellow. When the war starts, he is in Florida. He's the man given the job of defending that area. Yeah. Oh, by the way, his family was from Geneva, hence the last name. So anyway, he did pretty well in the 7 Years' War. He's in command in Florida. He helps deflect several American attempts to take the place over. He then marches towards Savannah, and Campbell had already captured it, but Prevost is the main commander, going to be the main commander in Georgia. Now, Campbell and Prevost are an odd relationship. Prevost was older, and his health wasn't in the best shape. Campbell said, "You'll be good in the garrison. I'll lead the main force." But then Campbell was sent out. Then the French and Americans invaded Georgia and tried to take back Savannah. So Prevost now finds himself in a difficult position. He has to defend the city of Savannah. He is grossly outnumbered, and the entrenchments were not even ready. So what does he do? He meets with the French delegation. He says, I need a day to figure things out. And the French officer lets him do that. That day, he's able to get some entrenchments set up, and British reinforcements arrive. He can now hold the town. And by the way, he's well stocked, so he can withstand a very long siege. The French and the Americans will end up assaulting Savannah and lose horribly. One of the worst defeats suffered by us during the Revolution. So Prevost wins this big victory. When I say a big victory, so important was this victory, they rang bells in London and there were parades. Henry Clinton called it, at that moment, the most pivotal British victory of the war. Yeah, and that's because, think about it, if the Americans had won at Savannah, well, there goes the city they just captured. The Southern strategy, which was looking promising, is suddenly lost. I think the British would have called it quits. But they're able to win Savannah. This major victory, I think that's really what boosts the British and says, we can do this. This battle drags the war on. And of course, if the British are able to pull something off last year's, we would consider Savannah the turning point of the American Revolution, not Saratoga. Yeah. Now, was Prevost like some great commander? No, but he was good administrator. He did very well in the defense of Savannah, both setting it up and with the negotiations with the French. There have been some accusations that Prevost, I've read some accusations, but Prevost might have considered surrendering, but I just don't see that in him. You know? I'll give him a B. it does keep the British war effort going, I'd say. Because when they do not only do they take Georgia out of the equation, not that Georgia's that vital, but hey, you've taken a colony back. In that Georgia campaign, they fight 4 major battles, win 3 of the 4. That's important too, because the only battle they lost was Kettle Creek, which there were no British soldiers there. It was just loyalists and rebels. So it also, I think, also reestablished confidence in the British Army after they had lost Saratoga, and also after Monmouth, where the American Army, even though Monmouth's textbook definition of a draw, most British officers with a brain understood that at Monmouth, the American Army proved they can fight in the field and hold their own. So Georgia really, the Georgia campaign really is crucial to the way the war is going to go. So there are the British officers in the American Revolution. What do you think? Yeah, it used to be something I was like really, really into. I still read about it though, and I still have books on the subject, of course. And sometimes I get into it. The last time I was really into it though was 2016, when I read a whole bunch of books in a few years. But it's still a war that I have a lot of interest in, and I think the British generals of this war, when I say underrated, as you can tell, a lot of them are not as well rated as Napoleon's marshals and commanders. But with a few exceptions, almost every man on this list had a victory or a signature accomplishment. And I say that because we kind of grew up with that idea of like, oh, the British generals in the Revolution were incompetent. I'm like, if they're so incompetent, how come it took us years to win? How can you explain battles like Savannah, Camden, Long Island, Brandywine? Didn't do. See, we don't even talk about that. Yeah, I will say, what really one of the things that started kind of my fascination with this was honestly in 5th grade, because a 5th grade history textbook showed a map of the Revolutionary War with all the battles. And I realized that the British had a lot of victories, like it was like half the map, but the battles weren't discussed at all in the textbook. So I remember asking my teacher, I was like, what's Germantown? Why do we lose? He just couldn't answer me, and the textbook didn't even mention it. All the textbook mentioned was the battles we won. The only battle they talked about that we lost was Bunker Hill, because it's famous and because, hey, the British lost a lot of men there. I mean, it was hilarious. Like the book almost went from Saratoga like straight to Yorktown. Like nothing happened in between. Yeah. So there's my there's one of the things that started my little fascination with the period. I mean, I love the period anyway, both the musket combat and the Age of Enlightenment, the philosophies being debated, the revolutions, the wars. So this is my favorite era of history, is roughly 1700 to about 1865. That's my favorite era. But anyway, so there's my little analysis of the British officers. Hope some people learned a few things there. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that sounds like a pretty good one. I didn't see that poll you mentioned. What else do you put on that poll? Oh God. I don't feel able enough to do Frederick the Great's generals. I mean, I know them pretty well, but I don't know enough about them to talk about them the way I can with these guys. Um, I mean, I could talk about select ones. I honestly really want to do that World War II one where we're like, okay, Luftwaffe, U.S. Air Force, Soviet Air Force, Yeah, I think that'd be cool, and I think I'd like that one. Also, might be good to get skits for a minute. Russian generals in World War One, ladies and gentlemen, I am completely unprepared for that topic. I mean, I know about a few of them, like Brusilov, but I mean, I can I can contribute to that one. I have some opinions on, of course, the headliners, and my probably my favorite of the Russian generals is Vautin, the one who died in Ukraine partisan attack. Oh, great! Well, that's charming. Oh, that's Stalin. It's it's like having a psychopath for your manager, right? Jesus Christ. Yeah, I mean, you get like I guess there's just that guy you just like and keep around. You're talking about Vorshilov is the Alexander Leslie of the Soviet command. Well, there's also that idea that you don't want anybody too good in charge, right? Like in our Forgotten Battles episode about the Operation Solstice, we make the point that that Solstice really wasn't that big of a deal, but Stalin used it as an excuse to further undermine, because of course he's getting more afraid of Zhukov by the end of World War II. Konev, Konev. That Konev was the one who, when the war's over, he gets the higher rank in the Soviet army post World War II, or at least like exactly. I mean, nothing against Konev. From what I've read, he was a very effective commander. Um, the Soviets really, I mean, this, I mean, this. Think about the Soviet military. Tactically, never really that proficient. I mean, better as the war went on, but not that proficient. Like small unit tactics side. But they become the masters of operational warfare. But they can also afford to do the kind of stuff they're doing in the Eastern Front because it's a totalitarian state with a large man pool that's just churning out tanks. You know, and I don't want to like play into the myth of the Asiatic horde that the Nazi generals try to use an excuse for them losing. But there is something to be said for the Soviets having material advantages, especially as the war goes on. Um, but that said, I think like the Soviet military in many ways is, of World War II is kind of a miracle. They go from suffering some of the worst, actually the worst defeats the army has ever suffered, to being able to inflict some of the worst defeats that the Germans ever suffered. It's pretty remarkable. Well, yeah, I think this is what I would say. What I've read, at least the smarter German generals would say, is that okay? You're right. The Soviets have the same thing going on, but there started to be, at least with smarter German officers, a grudging respect to the fact that the Soviets were pulling off battles of encirclement, daring maneuvers. We just weren't. And the American army in World War II proved to be very proficient at defense. But I would say offensively, we were kind of like tended to do a lot of World War One style offensives, like Herkin Forest, the drive towards Rome, if you will, even Normandy, of course. The Americans didn't start doing real lightning maneuvers like stuff the Soviets would have found impressive until they crossed the Rhine. I'm not saying the American Army in World War II is bad, though. They did very good on defense, of course. That's kind of the American military tradition up until post World War II, as we were known for dogged defenses. But also, the American Army's tactics, in some ways, I'm a bit more impressed with them in the Pacific theater, considering the kind of challenge they faced. But I mean, even in the Pacific theater, like the Battle of Buno, the one north of Port Moresby, I mean, that's essentially just a World War I grind fest. The losses were horrendous. Morale went straight down the shitter. There's a reason Australians didn't like Douglas MacArthur. You know? So yeah, I'm not here to bash the American Army in World War II by any means. They got the job done, and overall they were good. But I think the Soviet and German ones did more impressive and crazy stuff. But they're also totalitarian governments, Like Americans might be a little more worried about casualty lists than the Soviets are. Anyway, that's just some random thoughts. One can get more into it when we talk about it. And like you said, you know a decent amount about the Air Forces. The Air Force is more of a weak spot for me. Real strong spot for me is the Navy. So here I am talking about the American Army. The American Navy in World War II is like their S tier. No doubt about it. Like after a few early stumbles, it becomes the most powerful naval force the world has ever seen, and we've pretty much controlled the oceans ever since. It's remarkable. Oh yeah, that problem cropped up in the Baltic Sea with the Swedes. They were producing really quiet diesel-electric subs. But I was talking to an old Navy submariner, and he said amongst submarine people, there's a view that surface ships are just victims. Yeah, they're just like but also because they've gotten so good at being quiet that they're like, look, they don't know we're there until we sink one of their ships, essentially. So yeah, no, I know. There's like a diesel electric revolution going on in the navies of the world, from what I've read, and oh yeah, the U.S. Navy could definitely lose a battle right now from just from land-based missiles. We've got enough of them, right? So I'm not here to say we're invincible or anything. I remember one idiot guy worked with at Target. It's kind of those like autistic libertarian types, and he was like, he's like, nothing can sink a super carrier, and I'm like, yeah, sure, ships never sink. You can never sink a ship. Oh yeah, I mentioned the Titanic. He's like, I'm tired of hearing about the Titanic, and I'm like, because it. Well, to his credit, I mean, people get tired of being told about the Titanic in that regard. But I'm like, there's a reason, man. Ships sink. I mean, not just that. I mean, the Soviets. I don't know if it would have worked, but the Soviets had an entire tactic to deal with U.S. carriers. The backfire attacks. That's a. Yeah, yeah. Uh, oh yeah, yeah. In fact, the Russians were kind of pioneers in the use of anti-ship missiles. the real revolution with like anti-ship missiles apparently was the Egyptian Navy used some Soviet missiles in the 60s, I want to say. So yeah, I mean, it's not easy to sink a super carrier, but you can do it. Yeah, but the carriers also have their own purpose. I get why we build them. You know? Oh yeah, no, uh, the um I mean, they can react to a disaster, and they have like they'll be able to bring supplies in. Yeah, I mean, yeah, it might be. Although I know the Royal Navy right now is kind of at a low point. Yeah, you can make a case that this is the lowest point since the time the Dutch snuck into a harbor and seized a bunch of ships in the 1600s. Um, oh yeah, that's quite a reach. Wow. Yeah, I gotta say, and it's kind of like those historians like 2 years ago they paneled they old American historians who's the worst president in American history, and they all like Trump won, and I was like, dude, the presidency's not over, you know. Right. Or God, remember that board game Labyrinth, the War on Terror, and it came out, and we're like, dude, the war's not over. What are you doing making a game about a war that isn't over? Yeah, I'm just like, yeah, yeah. Look. President's term isn't over. Iraq wasn't over. The war on terror. I mean, it's stupid, man. Like, don't write a book until the damn thing is over. Yeah, yeah. Sure. We'll go ahead and I guess go ahead and call it quits and whatnot. All right.